They found him standing alone in the palace corridor at 3 in the morning, still wearing his ceremonial uniform from the state dinner, staring at portraits of dead kings who had never smiled. The photographs would surface later, grainy security footage of a man unraveling in real time, talking to paintings like they might offer answers to questions he was too afraid to ask aloud. Within 72 hours, that same man would destroy 3 centuries of carefully constructed royal mythology with 6 words spoken into a live microphone. But on this particular night, Alexander Beaumont was still pretending he could survive the life that was killing him. The truth is, some prisons are built from gold and admiration, and those are the hardest ones to escape. What happened next changed everything, and if you stay with me, you'll understand why some acts of rebellion are actually acts of survival. This is that story. Mate. The morning Alexander turned 32, he woke up in a bed that cost more than most people earned in a decade and felt absolutely nothing. Rain hammered against the windows of his private chambers in Kensington Palace, that relentless London rain that turned the city gray and made everyone move a little slower. He lay there for 11 minutes, counting the seconds between thunderclaps, wondering if anyone would notice if he simply didn't get up. Of course they would notice. They always noticed. His private secretary knocked exactly 3 times at 6:45, the sound sharp and efficient. "Come in, Geoffrey." The door opened. Geoffrey Pemberton entered carrying a leather portfolio and the expression of a man who had long ago accepted that his job required him to wake princes who didn't want to be woken. "Good morning, Your Grace. Happy birthday." "Is it?" Geoffrey paused, then continued as if Alexander hadn't spoken. "You have the infrastructure briefing at 8, followed by the Veterans Charity Luncheon at noon. The Prime Minister's office has requested a private meeting at 3 to discuss the engagement announcement timeline. Your mother expects you for tea at 5. Lady Evelyn will join you." Alexander closed his eyes. "How long until the engagement becomes official?" "The formal announcement is scheduled for next Tuesday. The ceremony is being planned for early December. Westminster Abbey. Full state occasion, 6 months. Yes, Your Grace." Alexander sat up slowly, his body moving through motions it had performed thousands of times. Feet on the floor, stand, walk to the bathroom, shower, shave, dress, become the version of himself that everyone expected. Geoffrey lingered near the door. "The tailors need final measurements for your ceremonial uniform. And your father called. He wants to discuss your speech for the Conservative Party gala. Tell him I'll review his notes. He was quite insistent, Your Grace. Then tell him I'll review them twice." Geoffrey's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Very good, sir." After Geoffrey left, Alexander stood in front of the bathroom mirror in his towel, studying his own reflection like he was looking at a stranger. Somewhere in the past decade, his face had hardened into something perpetually formal. His jaw was always set. His eyes were always measured. Even alone, he looked like he was posing for currency. He'd stopped recognizing himself around age 24. The infrastructure briefing was exactly as soul-crushing as he'd anticipated. 14 ministers sitting around a mahogany table, presenting slide after slide about railway modernization and broadband expansion, occasionally glancing at him as if his presence validated their existence. Alexander nodded at appropriate intervals, asked 2 intelligent questions he didn't care about, and spent most of the meeting watching rain streak down the conference room windows. Afterward, his chief of staff cornered him in the hallway. "Your Grace, we need to finalize your remarks for the engagement press conference. The media team has prepared 3 drafts. James? I haven't even proposed yet." James Worthington, a man whose entire personality was constructed from anxiety and expensive cologne, blinked rapidly. "The proposal is scheduled for Saturday evening. The ring has been selected. The photographers will be positioned at—" "I know the plan, James. Then you understand why we need the remarks finalized. This is the most significant royal engagement in 15 years. Every word will be analyzed." Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest. "Fine. Send me the drafts. We really should discuss them in person. There are nuances." "Send me the drafts, James." James's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. The Veterans Luncheon was held at a hotel in Mayfair, the kind of place where every surface gleamed and waiters moved like shadows. Alexander sat at the head table between a decorated colonel and a woman who had lost both legs in Afghanistan. He listened to speeches about sacrifice and duty, words that should have moved him, but instead felt like they were being spoken in a language he no longer understood. The woman beside him, Major Sarah Chen, leaned over during dessert. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." Alexander turned to her, startled. "I'm sorry?" "Don't be. I get it. These things are performances." She gestured at the room with her fork. "Everyone here is playing a role. You're just better at it than most." "Am I? You tell me. Are you actually invested in railway infrastructure, or were you thinking about something else during that entire meeting this morning?" Alexander stared at her. "How did you—" "I have friends at the ministry." She smiled, sharp and knowing. "Relax, Your Grace. Your secret's safe with me." "What secret?" "That you're human." Something about the way she said it made Alexander's throat tight. He looked down at his untouched cake, an elaborate construction of chocolate and gold leaf that probably cost 40 pounds a slice. "Can I ask you something, Major Chen?" "Sarah." "And yes, do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" She considered this. "Every day for 2 years after I got injured, I kept trying to be the person I was before, and it nearly destroyed me. Then I realized that person was gone, and I had to decide who I wanted to become instead. And who did you become? Someone who tells the truth more often. It's terrifying, but at least I can sleep at night." Alexander wanted to ask her how she'd found the courage to make that choice, but his mother's private secretary appeared beside his chair, whispering that the Prime Minister's office had moved his meeting up an hour. He excused himself with practiced grace, shook hands with people whose names he would forget immediately, and climbed into the back of a car that would carry him to another obligation. The Prime Minister wanted to discuss optics, specifically how Alexander's engagement to Lady Evelyn Carrington would stabilize the government's relationship with conservative voters and wealthy donors. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and made Alexander feel like a corporate asset being leveraged for market share. When he finally returned to Kensington Palace, it was nearly 5. His mother was waiting in the blue drawing room, Lady Evelyn beside her on a silk sofa, both of them looking like they'd been posed by a photographer. "Alexander, darling." His mother, Queen Consort Catherine, smiled with the warmth of a diplomat. "You're late." The Prime Minister was verbose. Politicians usually are. She gestured to the chair across from them. "Sit. We need to discuss the engagement tour." Evelyn has some thoughts about the itinerary. Lady Evelyn Carrington was 28, beautiful in the way that expensive education and careful breeding produced, and utterly terrified of disappointing anyone. Alexander had known her since childhood. She was kind, intelligent, and completely wrong for him in every way that mattered. "I thought we might include a stop in Edinburgh," she said softly. "My grandmother's family has ties there, and it would be lovely symbolism." "Excellent idea." Catherine nodded approvingly. "Alexander, what do you think? Whatever you both prefer." Evelyn's smile faltered slightly. "Alexander, you should have opinions about this. It's our engagement tour. I'm sure you'll plan something beautiful." Evelyn looked at Catherine, uncertainty flickering across her face. Catherine's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Alexander could see the calculation behind her eyes. "Evelyn, dear, would you excuse us for a moment? I need to speak with my son privately." Evelyn stood immediately, relief and hurt competing in her posture. "Of course, Your Majesty." After she left, Catherine waited exactly 5 seconds before speaking. "What are you doing, Alexander?" "Having tea. Don't be clever. You're treating that girl like a business transaction. Isn't that what this is?" Catherine's teacup hit the saucer with a sharp click. "This is your future, your duty, your responsibility to this family and this country. My prison sentence." The words hung in the air like smoke. Catherine's voice dropped to something dangerous. "You think you're the first person in this family to feel trapped? You think your father woke up excited to spend his life cutting ribbons and shaking hands? We all make sacrifices, Alexander. That's what it means to serve. And what if I don't want to serve anymore? Then you're more selfish than I thought." Alexander stood, his hands shaking. "I'm 32 years old and I've never made a single decision about my own life. Not one. Where I went to school, who I associated with, what charities I supported, who I'm supposed to marry, all of it was decided by committees and advisors and traditions older than God. So forgive me if I'm not performing gratitude with enough enthusiasm." Catherine stood as well, her face flushed. You were born into privilege that billions of people will never experience. You have wealth, influence, and a platform to make genuine change in this world. And you're sulking like a teenager because you have to marry a perfectly suitable woman and attend some tedious meetings. I'm suffocating." The rawness in his voice seemed to stun her. For just a moment, Catherine's armor cracked, and Alexander saw something that might have been recognition, might have been memory. Then it was gone. "We all suffocate, Alexander. That's not unique to you. The difference is that most of us have the decency not to whine about it." She walked out, leaving Alexander alone in a room full of priceless furniture and absolutely nothing that felt like home. He didn't remember deciding to leave the palace. He just found himself walking through Kensington Gardens as evening settled over London, his security detail maintaining a discreet distance. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled wet and cold. Tourists photographed the palace gates. Joggers ran past without recognizing him in his plain coat and scarf. Alexander kept walking, no destination in mind, just movement. He ended up near Windsor by accident, or perhaps by instinct. The streets were quieter here, lined with small shops and cafes that catered to locals rather than tourists. He turned down a narrow side street and saw her for the first time. She was setting up a flower stand outside a cafe, moving with quick efficiency despite the cold. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and she wore a jacket that was 2 sizes too large. She looked about 25, maybe younger, and she was singing something under her breath while she arranged buckets of roses and chrysanthemums. Alexander stopped walking. She glanced up, caught him staring, and raised an eyebrow. "You gonna buy something or just stand there looking constipated?" Her accent was working-class London, sharp and unfiltered. Alexander blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The flowers." She gestured impatiently. "You want some or not?" "I'm trying to close up. I wasn't—" He trailed off, then walked closer. "What do you recommend?" "Depends. Who are you buying them for?" "Myself." She laughed, bright and startled. "Yourself? What, you got a hot date with your mirror?" Something like that. She studied him with open curiosity, taking in his expensive coat and careful posture. "You're not from around here." "No." "Figures." She selected a small bundle of white roses and wrapped them in brown paper with practiced speed. "These are simple. Classic. Won't make you look like you're trying too hard." "How much?" £12. Alexander handed her a 20. "Keep the change." She looked at the bill, then at him. "You trying to impress me or something? Is it working?" "Not really. Rich guys buying flowers from street vendors is pretty cliché. I'm not trying to be cliché." "Then stop acting like your money makes you interesting." She handed him the roses, her fingers brushing his briefly. "Have a nice night, stranger." Alexander stood there holding the flowers like an idiot while she went back to organizing her stand. He should have left, should have returned to the palace and the life waiting for him there. Instead, he heard himself say, "What's your name?" She glanced back, surprised. "Clara. Clara Whitmore." What? "I'm Alexander." "Okay, Alexander, you gonna stand there all night, or you got somewhere to be?" "Nowhere important." Clara snorted. "Must be nice." Over the next 2 weeks, Alexander returned to that street corner 6 times. He told himself he was just taking walks, clearing his head, enjoying some freedom. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. Clara Whitmore treated him like a human being instead of a symbol, and he was addicted to the feeling. She teased him about his stiff posture and formal vocabulary. She asked questions that had nothing to do with duty or legacy. She talked about her life, struggling to keep her flower stand profitable, arguments with her landlord, dreams of someday opening a real shop, with an honesty that made Alexander's carefully constructed public persona feel like a lie. On his 4th visit, she invited him to the cafe for coffee. "You drink coffee, right? Or do fancy people only drink, like, champagne and sadness?" "I drink coffee." The cafe was small and warm, condensation fogging the windows. They sat at a corner table, and Claire complained about a customer who'd tried to haggle over roses while Alexander listened like she was revealing state secrets. "Why do you keep coming back here?" she asked suddenly. Alexander looked up from his cup. "What? To this street. You're clearly not local. You dress like you walked out of a catalog, and you buy flowers you don't need, so what's the deal? Maybe I like the company." Clara studied him, her expression shifting into something more serious. You running from something? Yes. Want to talk about it? No. Fair enough, she leaned back in her chair. But just so you know, whatever you're avoiding, it's going to catch up eventually. That's how life works. What if I don't want it to catch up? Then you're going to spend your whole life running, and that sounds exhausting. Alexander smiled despite himself. You're very wise for someone who sells flowers. I'm very broke for someone who sells flowers. Wisdom is free. They stayed in that cafe for 2 hours, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered. When Alexander finally left, Clara walked him to the corner. Same time next week? She asked. If you'll have me. I'll think about it. She grinned. Bring better conversation next time. He returned 3 days later instead of 7. Clara was arguing with a delivery driver about damaged stems when Alexander approached, and she lit up when she saw him. You're early. I got impatient. She laughed, delighted and surprised, and something in Alexander's chest cracked open. They fell into a rhythm. Alexander would slip away from palace obligations whenever possible, showing up at Clara's stand in the evening. They'd drink coffee, walk through Windsor's quieter streets, talk about everything except who Alexander really was. He told her pieces of truth, that he felt trapped in his work, that his family didn't understand him, that he'd never chosen the life he was living. She told him about losing her mother to cancer, about working 3 jobs to keep the flower stand running, about refusing to let circumstances crush her optimism. One night, sitting on a bench near the Thames, Clara turned to him. You ever going to tell me what you actually do? Alexander hesitated. It's complicated. Try me. I work for a very old family business. Lots of expectations. Not much freedom. Sounds miserable. It is. So quit. Alexander laughed, bitter and sharp. I can't just quit. Why not? It's your life. Is it? The question hung between them. Clara reached over and took his hand, her fingers rough from work and cold from the night air. Alexander, I don't know what's going on with you, and I'm not going to push, but whoever told you that your life belongs to someone else is wrong. It doesn't. It belongs to you. Alexander looked at their joined hands, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe. Or terror. Or both. What if I don't know how to take it back? Then you start small. Make one choice that's yours. Then another. Then another. She squeezed his hand. Eventually, you'll look up and realize you're living a life that actually fits. He kissed her that night, standing on a bridge with London stretching out around them in a scatter of lights and rain. Clara kissed him back like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he wasn't about to become engaged to someone else, like his life wasn't a carefully orchestrated performance. For those few moments, Alexander felt real. But reality has a way of destroying beautiful lies. The next morning, photographs appeared in the Daily Mail. Alexander spotted them on Jeffrey's tablet during their morning briefing, his stomach dropping into freefall. Duke Alexander's mystery woman. Secret romance rocks royal engagement plans. The photos were grainy but unmistakable. Alexander and Clara on the bridge. Alexander and Clara in the cafe. Alexander and Clara holding hands like they had every right to. Jeffrey's voice was carefully neutral. Your mother has requested an immediate meeting. Your father is flying in from Scotland. The palace press office is being flooded with inquiries. Alexander couldn't breathe. Who took these? We don't know yet. But sir, we need to control this narrative before what, Jeffrey? Before everyone discovers I'm a human being who wanted one piece of his life to be his own? Jeffrey's expression softened, just slightly. I understand this is difficult, Your Grace, but you have to understand the position this puts the family in. The engagement announcement is in 4 days. Lady Evelyn's family is already asking questions. Let them ask. Alexander, I need to see Clara. That would be unwise. I don't care. Sir, if you go to her now, the media will follow. They'll destroy her. Is that what you want? The question hit like a physical blow. Alexander sat down heavily, his hands shaking. What do I do? Jeffrey hesitated, then spoke with uncommon gentleness. You do what you've always done, Your Grace. You put duty first. The meeting with his parents was apocalyptic. His father, King Edward, paced the private study like a caged animal while Catherine sat rigid on the sofa, her face carved from ice. An absolute disaster, Edward roared. 4 days before the most important announcement of your life, and you're photographed with some nobody from the streets. Her name is Clara. I don't care if her name is Helen of bloody Troy. You've humiliated this family, humiliated Evelyn, and given every Republican in this country ammunition to tear us apart. Alexander stood his ground. I fell in love with her. The room went silent. Catherine stood slowly, her voice deadly calm. What did you say? I said I fell in love with her. Clara. The woman in the photographs. Edward's face turned purple. You don't know what love is. You know duty. You know responsibility. You know that your actions have consequences that extend far beyond your own selfish desires. Maybe I'm tired of living for consequences. Then you're not fit to be a member of this family. The words landed like a sentence. Alexander looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw a man who had strangled every personal desire for 60 years and expected his son to do the same. Maybe I'm not, Alexander said quietly. Catherine stepped between them. Stop, both of you. She turned to Alexander. This girl, Clara, does she know who you are? No. Does she know about Evelyn? Alexander's silence was answer enough. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. You've built a fantasy, Alexander, a secret world where you can pretend to be ordinary. But you're not ordinary. You never will be. And the sooner you accept that, the less damage you'll cause to everyone around you. What if I don't want to accept it? Then you'll destroy yourself and take this family down with you. Edward moved to the window, his voice heavy. The engagement announcement will proceed as scheduled. You will marry Evelyn in December, and you will never see this Clara person again. Those are your options. And if I refuse, then you renounce your titles, your position in the line of succession, and any financial support from the crown. You'll be stripped of everything that makes you who you are. Maybe that's exactly what I need. Edward turned, his expression something between fury and heartbreak. You're my son. I'm trying to save you from yourself. No, Alexander said softly. You're trying to save the institution. I've never been more than a piece on your chessboard. He left before either of them could respond, walking through palace corridors that suddenly felt like they were closing in. His phone buzzed with messages from advisors, from James, from Evelyn. He ignored all of them. He needed to see Clara, needed to explain, needed to... His chief of security stopped him at the palace entrance. I wouldn't, Your Grace. There are photographers camped outside her flower stand, dozens of them. Alexander's heart sank. Is she there? She was this morning. They're asking her questions, shouting, following her. Oh, God. Sir, if you go there now, it will only make it worse. Alexander stood in the doorway, paralyzed between two impossible choices. Stay and accept the life that was killing him. Go and destroy the woman he loved. He chose wrong. He stayed. That night, alone in his chambers, Alexander watched news coverage of Clara being mobbed by reporters outside her flower stand. She looked terrified and furious, trying to shield her face while cameras flashed. The headlines were vicious. Royal Home Wrecker. Who is the mystery woman destroying a fairy tale engagement? Gold digger or genuine? Inside Clara Whitmore's secret affair with Duke Alexander. They tore apart her life in real time, her financial struggles, her mother's death, her working-class background. They made her sound calculating and manipulative, a social climber who'd seduced a naive prince. Alexander called her phone 17 times. She never answered. At midnight, James appeared at his door with a grim expression. Lady Evelyn's family is threatening to withdraw from the engagement publicly. They're calling it a humiliation. Your mother wants you to issue a statement denouncing the relationship before morning. What kind of statement? One that makes it clear this was a mistake, that Clara Whitmore means nothing to you, that your commitment to Evelyn and the crown remains absolute. Alexander felt something inside him shatter. And if I don't? Then Evelyn's father goes to the press with his own statement, and we lose control of the narrative completely. The monarchy takes another public hit. Your brother becomes the new heir apparent, and you spend the rest of your life known as the prince who chose a fling over duty. James paused, then added quietly, and Clara Whitmore's life gets even worse. The media will never leave her alone if this story doesn't end cleanly. Alexander looked at the statement James had prepared, the words that would erase everything he'd felt over the past month. would turn the most real relationship of his life into a royal scandal to be managed and buried. His hand trembled as he reached for the pen. Then he stopped. No. James blinked. Sir? I'm not signing this. Alexander, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. I understand that everyone wants me to sacrifice the one thing that's ever made me feel human so that an institution built on centuries of repression can maintain its image. I understand that my happiness matters less than political optics. I understand all of it, James. He stood, his voice strengthening. But I'm done understanding. I'm done sacrificing. I'm done living a life that belongs to everyone except me. What are you saying? Alexander looked at his reflection in the dark window, barely recognizing the man staring back. I'm saying that tomorrow morning I'm going to find Clara Whitmore and tell her the truth about who I am, and then I'm going to make a choice that's actually mine. James went pale. You can't be serious. Watch me. Alexander, if you do this, there's no going back. Your family will disown you. The public will crucify you. You'll lose everything. Maybe. Alexander smiled, sharp and bitter, and finally free. Or maybe I'll finally find out who I am without the crown. He walked past James, out of his chambers, through the palace that had been his prison for 32 years. Guards tried to stop him. Advisors shouted his name. He ignored all of them, walking faster, then running, his heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to escape his body. He burst through the palace doors into cold night air, rain starting to fall again, photographers' cameras flashing like lightning. Your Grace, is it true you're abandoning the engagement? Duke Alexander, what about Lady Evelyn? Are you really in love with a commoner? Alexander stopped at the top of the palace steps, rain soaking through his shirt, and looked directly into the cameras. Yes, the word echoed across the courtyard, across the country, across every front page that would run his face tomorrow. Yes, I'm in love with Clara Whitmore. Yes, I'm walking away from the engagement. And yes, I'm finally choosing my own life. Then he walked down the steps, into the rain, into the unknown, leaving behind everything he'd ever been told he was supposed to be. Behind him, the palace doors stood open, golden light spilling out onto wet stones. He never looked back. The rain turned brutal as Alexander ran through Windsor's empty streets, his dress shoes slapping wet pavement, his lungs burning. He didn't have a plan, didn't have a car, didn't have anything except the memory of Clara's flower stand and the certainty that if he didn't reach her tonight, he'd lose the only honest thing he'd ever touched. His phone exploded with calls. Jeffrey, James, his mother. Unknown numbers that were probably journalists who'd somehow gotten his private line. He ignored them all, sprinting past closed shops and darkened cafes, following muscle memory to the corner where he'd first seen her arranging roses in the cold. The stand was gone. Alexander stopped, chest heaving, staring at the empty space where her buckets had been. A few crushed petals littered the pavement, trampled by the crowd of reporters who'd descended earlier. The cafe was dark. No one was around. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands and dialed her number again. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Her voice, bright and unguarded, told him to leave a message. Clara, it's me. I know you're angry. I know I lied. But please, just let me explain. Please don't. The line went dead. Alexander stood there in the rain, feeling the full weight of what he'd just destroyed settling onto his shoulders like concrete. He'd walked away from the palace, made a public declaration that would be dissected by every news outlet in the world by morning, burned every bridge with his family. And for what? A woman who wouldn't even answer his calls. Your Grace. Alexander spun around. His head of security, Marcus, stood 10 feet away with an umbrella and an expression of professional concern. You need to come with me, sir. It's not safe here. I'm not going back. I'm not asking you to go back. But standing in the street at 1 a.m. while half of London's paparazzi are looking for you is suicide. Marcus stepped closer. There's a car 2 blocks away. Let me get you somewhere secure, then you can figure out your next move. Alexander wanted to argue, but his teeth were chattering and his shirt was soaked through. He nodded. The safe house was a nondescript flat in Bloomsbury, owned by someone in the security apparatus who owed Marcus favors. It had beige furniture, no personality, and bars on the windows that made Alexander's skin crawl. Marcus handed him a towel. I'll be outside. You need anything? Call me. Find Clara Whitmore. Sir. That's what I need, Marcus. Find her. Make sure she's safe. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. I'll see what I can do. After he left, Alexander peeled off his wet clothes and stood in the shower until the water ran cold. When he finally emerged, wrapped in a robe that smelled like industrial detergent, he found his phone had accumulated 43 missed calls and 67 text messages. Most were from palace officials demanding he return immediately. Several were from journalists offering obscene amounts of money for exclusive interviews. 3 were from his brother, each one shorter and angrier than the last. The one that stopped him was from Evelyn. I hope she's worth it. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, staring at those 5 words until they blurred. Evelyn didn't deserve this. She'd been kind, patient, willing to build something together even though they both knew it would never be love, and he'd humiliated her in the most public way possible. He typed a response. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. But you did anyway. That's what makes it worse. You knew exactly what you were doing. The dots vanished. She didn't write again. Alexander didn't sleep. He sat by the window watching London wake up, waiting for Marcus to return with news about Clara. At 6 in the morning, every news channel in the country led with the same story. Royal rebellion. Duke Alexander renounces engagement in shocking declaration of love. They played the footage on loop. Alexander standing in the rain, water streaming down his face, saying yes to the cameras like it was a confession. The palace had issued a terse statement around 3 a.m., calling his behavior deeply disappointing and stating that the king and queen consort were considering all appropriate measures. Translation: they were about to strip him of everything. His phone rang. Jeffrey's name flashed on the screen. Alexander answered. Tell me. Jeffrey's voice was rough, like he hadn't slept either. Your father is convening the family council at noon. They're going to offer you one chance to walk this back. Public apology, commitment to Evelyn, psychiatric evaluation to explain your behavior. And if I refuse, then they invoke the 1917 letters patent and remove you from the line of succession. Strip your titles, cut off your allowances. You'll have nothing, Alexander. No money, no position, no protection. Good. Jeffrey was silent for a long moment. You're serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. What about Clara Whitmore? Have you even spoken to her? Not yet. Alexander, she gave an interview to The Guardian 2 hours ago. You should read it. Alexander's stomach dropped. What did she say? Read it yourself. I'll send you the link. The article loaded on his phone with agonizing slowness. The headline made his chest tight. I never asked for this. Clara Whitmore speaks out about royal romance scandal. The photograph showed Clara looking exhausted and furious, sitting in what appeared to be a friend's flat. The interview was devastating. I met him as Alexander, she said in the article. Just Alexander. A guy who seemed lost and sad and like he needed someone to talk to. I had no idea who he really was. No idea he was engaged. No idea he was about to blow up my entire life for some fantasy he'd built in his head. The journalist asked if she loved him. I thought I did. But you can't love someone who's been lying to you from the first conversation. I don't even know who he is. Duke Alexander Beaumont isn't the person I fell for. That person doesn't exist. She went on to describe the media circus that had descended on her life. Reporters camped outside her flat. Her landlord threatening eviction because of the attention. Losing her flower stand because she couldn't work with cameras shoved in her face every 5 seconds. He destroyed my life, she said. And he did it without even asking if I wanted to be part of his rebellion. I was just a prop in his story. The commoner who made the prince feel real. Well, congratulations, Your Grace. You felt real, and I lost everything. Alexander read the interview 3 times, each word hitting harder than the last. She was right. About all of it. He'd been so focused on his own suffocation that he'd never considered what dragging her into his world would cost her. He called Marcus. Did you find her? Yes. She's staying with a friend in Camden. She's safe, but sir, she doesn't want to see you. I need to talk to her. She was very clear about that. If you show up, she'll call the police. Alexander closed his eyes. Marcus, I need you to deliver a message. Sir, please. Just tell her I'm sorry. Tell her she's right about everything. And tell her I'm going to fix this. How are you going to fix this? I don't know yet. The family council meeting happened without him. Alexander watched the news coverage from the Bloomsbury flat, drinking instant coffee that tasted like battery acid while royal correspondents speculated about his mental state and political motivations. At 2 p.m., the palace released an official statement. Following recent events and subsequent discussions with senior members of the royal family, Duke Alexander Beaumont has been removed from the line of succession and stripped of all royal titles, effective immediately. He will no longer represent the crown in any official capacity and will receive no financial support from the civil list. The family wishes him well in his future private life. Just like that, 32 years of identity erased in 3 sentences. Alexander's brother called 30 seconds after the announcement. You happy now? Sebastian's voice dripped with contempt. Alexander had always known his younger brother resented living in his shadow. Now that shadow was gone. Not particularly. You selfish bastard. Do you have any idea what you've done? Mum's in tears. Dad looks like he aged 10 years overnight, and Evelyn's family is threatening legal action for breach of promise. Tell them I'll sign whatever they want. Oh, you will. You'll sign everything they put in front of you because you have no leverage anymore. You're nobody, Alexander. Just some sad git who threw away a kingdom for a girl who doesn't even want you. The line went dead. Alexander sat in the silence of the safe house, feeling the enormity of his situation finally settling in. He had no title, no money beyond what was in his personal accounts, which would last maybe 6 months if he was careful. No prospects, no home, no family. And the woman he'd sacrificed everything for hated him. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news. If you need a place to stay, my door's open. Sarah Chen. It took him a moment to place the name. Major Sarah Chen, the veteran from the luncheon who told him that becoming someone who told the truth was terrifying but worth it. He texted back, "Why would you help me? Because I recognize someone in freefall. And because I meant what I said about choosing who you want to become." 20 minutes later, Alexander was in the back of Marcus's car, heading to an address in South London. Marcus had refused to abandon his post, despite Alexander no longer technically being his responsibility. "Where am I supposed to go, sir? Back to the palace to guard your brother? I'd rather eat glass. You don't work for me anymore, Marcus." "Respectfully, sir, you don't get to decide that." Sarah's flat was small but warm, filled with books and plants and photographs of places Alexander had only seen in briefings. She opened the door in sweatpants and an army t-shirt, took one look at his face, and pulled him inside. "You look like death." "I feel worse." "Good. That means you're actually processing what you did instead of hiding behind protocol." She pointed at the couch. "Sit, I'll make tea." While the kettle boiled, Sarah perched on the arm of a chair and studied him with the same sharp attention she'd given him at the luncheon. "So, you blew up your entire life for a woman you barely know, apparently. Why?" "Because she was the only thing that felt real. And now? Now she won't talk to me. My family disowned me, and I have no idea what happens next." Sarah poured 2 mugs of tea and handed him one. "You want my advice?" Desperately. "Stop trying to fix this. You can't. The mess is made. The damage is done. Trying to control the fallout is just palace thinking in a different package. Then what do? You sit in the wreckage for a while. You feel how bad it hurts. You accept that you made choices that destroyed people you care about. And then, when you're ready, you figure out who you actually are without the crown." Alexander drank his tea, letting the heat burn his throat. "How long did it take you, after you got injured?" 2 years of therapy and one very patient sister who didn't let me wallow forever." She smiled, sad and knowing. "You don't have 2 years, though. The media is going to eat you alive if you don't get ahead of this. I don't care about the media. You should, because right now you're the villain in every story. The spoiled prince who humiliated a good woman and destroyed a commoner's life for selfish reasons. If you want any chance of rebuilding, you need to change that narrative." "How?" "Tell the truth. The whole truth. Not the sanitized palace version." Alexander looked at her. "You mean an interview?" "I mean transparency. The one thing the royal family has never actually tried." Over the next 3 days, Alexander stayed in Sarah's spare room and watched his former life disintegrate in real time. Evelyn's family issued a statement calling him emotionally unstable and morally bankrupt. Conservative MPs used him as evidence that the monarchy needed stricter succession protocols. The tabloids published increasingly creative theories about his mental state, but something else was happening too. Social media filled with people defending him. Young people, mostly, who saw his choice as brave rather than reckless. Messages started flooding in from strangers sharing their own stories about escaping controlling families or refusing arranged marriages. A petition demanding the palace reinstate him gathered 200,000 signatures in 48 hours. Sarah watched him scroll through Twitter with something like satisfaction. See? You're not just a villain, you're a symbol. Of what? Depends on who's looking. Freedom to some, irresponsibility to others. She sat beside him on the couch. But symbols don't get to control their own meaning, so you might as well make sure the truth is out there. I tried. I told the cameras I loved her. You told them what you wanted. You didn't tell them why it mattered, or what it cost you, or how you feel about the people you hurt. Alexander thought about Evelyn's text, about Clara's interview, about his mother's face when she'd called him selfish. What if telling the truth just makes it worse? Then at least it'll be honest. On the fourth night, Alexander finally called The Guardian and offered them an exclusive interview. The journalist, a woman named Imani Okafor, who'd written sympathetically about him, agreed to meet at a neutral location. They sat in a quiet corner of a pub in Hackney, recording equipment on the table between them. "Why are you doing this?" Imani asked. "Because I owe people the truth." Evelyn. Clara. Everyone who thought they knew who I was. And who are you? Alexander looked at his hands, at the place where his signet ring used to sit. I'm someone who spent 32 years pretending to be okay with a life that was killing me. I'm someone who fell in love with a woman who saw past the performance and treated me like a human being. And I'm someone who made catastrophically selfish choices without considering the damage they'd cause. He looked up at Imani. I didn't mean to hurt Evelyn. She deserved honesty from the beginning, and I gave her a lie that we both tried to believe. I didn't mean to destroy Clara's life. I told myself I was protecting her by not revealing my identity, but really, I was protecting myself from having to face reality. What reality? That I was a coward. I wanted to feel normal without accepting that I could never be normal. I wanted freedom without paying the price for it. And when everything collapsed, I made a grand gesture that looked like courage but was really just me burning down the palace, so I wouldn't have to admit I'd never belonged there. The pub was silent except for the recording equipment's low hum. Do you regret it? Imani asked softly. Alexander considered the question with the kind of honesty he'd rarely allowed himself. I regret hurting Evelyn. I regret not being honest with Clara. I regret making my family choose between me and the institution they've devoted their lives to. But do I regret walking away? No. That was the first real choice I ever made, even though it cost you everything. Especially because it cost me everything. Alexander felt something loosen in his chest. I spent my whole life being told that duty was more important than happiness, that sacrifice was noble, that personal desires were selfish. And maybe there's truth in that. Maybe I am selfish, but I'd rather be selfish and real than dutiful and dead inside. What about Clara Whitmore? Alexander's voice went rough. She was right about me. I used her. Not consciously, not maliciously, but I still did it. I turned her into my escape route without asking if she wanted to be. And now her life is ruined because I couldn't be honest about who I was. Have you spoken to her? She won't talk to me, and I don't blame her. What would you say if she would listen? That I'm sorry, that she deserved better, that if I could go back and do it differently, I would. He paused. But I'd still walk away from the palace, just not toward her. I'd walk toward whoever I'm supposed to become. The interview ran the next morning with the headline, I was a coward. Former Duke Alexander speaks. The response was immediate and polarizing. Half the country called him brave for his honesty. The other half called it a manipulative PR move designed to rehabilitate his image. The palace refused to comment. Evelyn's family released a statement saying his apology was too little, too late, and Clara stayed silent. Alexander spent the following days trying to figure out how to survive as a private citizen. Sarah helped him open a bank account under his legal name, Alexander Beaumont, with no titles attached. Marcus connected him with a lawyer who could navigate the complex financial separation from the royal family. Strangers sent him job offers ranging from genuine opportunities to obvious publicity stunts. He turned down a reality show, 3 book deals, and an offer to be a brand ambassador for a luxury watch company. He accepted a position helping with administrative work at a veterans charity Sarah recommended. The pay was terrible. The work was boring. It felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. 2 weeks after the interview, Marcus appeared at Sarah's flat with news. Clara Whitmore is moving. Where? Edinburgh. She's got family there, leaving London next week. Alexander felt something crack in his chest. She's running. Can you blame her? No. Marcus shifted his weight. Sir, if you want to talk to her, this is probably your last chance. After she leaves, she'll disappear. She doesn't want to see me, I know. But you should decide if you can live with never having tried. Alexander thought about Clara's smile in the cafe, her laughter on the bridge, the way she'd held his hand and told him his life belonged to him. Can you get me her address? I can, but I can't protect you from whatever happens when you show up uninvited. I'm not asking you to. The flat in Camden was on the 3rd floor of a building that looked like it was held together by paint and prayer. Alexander stood outside for 15 minutes, rehearsing what he'd say before finally pressing the buzzer. A crackling voice came through the intercom. Yeah? Clara, it's Alexander. Please, just give me 5 minutes. Silence. Then, you've got 3. The buzzer sounded. Alexander climbed the stairs with his heart trying to escape his ribcage. Clara opened the door before he could knock. She looked thinner than he remembered, shadows under her eyes, her expression carved from granite. Talk. Alexander had prepared a speech. It evaporated the moment he saw her. I ruined your life. Yeah, you did. I told myself I was protecting you by not revealing who I was, but really I was just a coward who wanted to pretend he could be normal. Clara crossed her arms. Anything else? I used you. Not intentionally, but that doesn't matter. I made you part of my escape plan without your consent. And when everything exploded, I made grand gestures that were really about me, not you. She leaned against the doorframe, her eyes hard. You done? No. Alexander swallowed. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I lied. I'm sorry I dragged you into something you never signed up for. I'm sorry your life is a nightmare because I was too selfish and broken to think past my own pain. Clara stared at him for a long moment. Okay. Okay? Yeah. Apology accepted. Now leave. She started to close the door. Alexander put his hand against it. Clara, please, please, what, Alexander? She stepped closer, her voice shaking. You want forgiveness? You want me to tell you it's okay, that you meant well, that we can still be something? She laughed, bitter and sharp. We were never something. We were a fantasy you built because your real life sucked. That's not true. No? Then tell me one real thing about the person you were when we met. One thing that wasn't a lie or an omission or carefully constructed performance. Alexander opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. I can't. Exactly. Claire's eyes were wet now, furious. You fell in love with the idea of being free. I was just the prop that made it feel possible. And the worst part is, I actually cared about you, the real you, whoever the hell that is. I cared about you too. No, you didn't. You cared about how I made you feel. There's a difference. The words hit like physical blows. Alexander felt his throat closing. You're right. About all of it. I don't know who I am. I don't know how to be a person instead of a symbol. I don't know anything except that meeting you was the first time in my life I felt like I could breathe. Clara wiped her eyes angrily. That's not my responsibility to fix. I know, and I'm not interested in being your therapist or your redemption arc. I know that too. Then why are you here? Because I needed you to know that even though I destroyed everything, you weren't wrong about me. When you said my life belonged to me, you were right. I just didn't know how to take it back without burning down everyone around me. Clara looked at him for a long time, something complicated moving across her face. I'm leaving London. Starting over somewhere that doesn't have cameras on every corner or people who recognize me as the girl who ruined a royal engagement. I'm going to rebuild my life without you in it. I understand. Good. She stepped back. Don't contact me again, Alexander. I mean it. No calls, no texts, no showing up wherever I end up. You wanted freedom? Well, here it is. Now go figure out what to do with it. She closed the door. Alexander stood in his hallway, listening to the sound of locks clicking into place, feeling the finality of it settle into his bones. Marcus was waiting by the car when Alexander emerged onto the street. He took one look at Alexander's face and said nothing, just opened the door. They drove in silence for 20 minutes before Alexander spoke. I need to disappear for a while. Where to? Anywhere that isn't London. Marcus glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Running away? Learning the difference. They ended up in Cornwall, in a village so small it didn't have a proper high street. Sarah knew someone who owned a cottage that needed repairs in exchange for rent. Alexander moved in with 2 suitcases of clothes Marcus had salvaged from the palace and absolutely no plan beyond making it through each day. He learned to fix the cottage's leaking roof, learned to shop at markets where no one recognized him, learned to introduce himself as just Alexander, no titles, no qualifications. The locals treated him with polite suspicion until he proved he could work, then they ignored him like everyone else. It was the most peaceful he'd ever been. But peace wasn't the same as resolution. 3 months after he'd left London, Alexander sat in the cottage watching the news on a laptop Sarah had lent him. The royal family had moved on. Sebastian was being groomed as the new heir apparent. His parents appeared at state functions looking older but composed. Evelyn had gotten engaged to a Scottish earl with better judgment than Alexander had ever possessed. And Clara had vanished completely from public view, exactly as she'd wanted. Alexander closed the laptop and stared at the wall, feeling the weight of everything he'd destroyed and everything he'd gained pressing down in equal measure. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. You coming back to London anytime soon? The charity could use you. Alexander looked around the cottage, at the roof he'd repaired, the garden he'd started, the life he'd built from absolute nothing. He typed back. Not yet. Still figuring things out. 3 dots appeared, then, take your time. But don't take forever. The world's still out there when you're ready. Alexander set the phone down and walked outside into cold Cornwall air, watching the sun set over cliffs that had stood for millions of years and would stand for millions more. Somewhere in Edinburgh, Clara Whitmore was building a new life without him. Somewhere in London, his former family was pretending he'd never existed. And here, in a village whose name he could barely pronounce, Alexander Beaumont was trying to figure out who he'd be without a crown or a woman to save him. The answer, he was beginning to understand, would take longer than 3 months to find. It might take the rest of his life. And for the first time since he'd stood in the rain outside Windsor Palace, that possibility didn't terrify him. It felt like something he could actually survive. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Alexander was replacing rotted floorboards in the cottage kitchen. His phone buzzed against the workbench, an unknown London number flashing across the screen. He almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant journalists who'd tracked him down or solicitors handling the endless legal separation from the palace. But something made him pick up. Mr. Beaumont? The voice was unfamiliar, professional, female. Speaking. My name is Rachel Driving. I'm an investigative journalist with the Times. I need to speak with you about Clara Whitmore. Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. I have nothing to say about Clara. Even if I told you she's been selling information about your relationship to tabloids for the past 4 months? The floor seemed to tilt beneath Alexander's feet. What? Rachel's voice was clinical, detached. We've been investigating payments made to Ms. Whitmore by 3 separate publications. The Sun, the Mail, Heat magazine. Total amount so far is roughly £85,000. In exchange, she's been providing intimate details about your time together. Text messages, photographs, private conversations. You're lying. I have bank records. I have emails between her and editors. I have screenshots of messages she claims you sent her. Rachel paused. Mr. Beaumont, I'm offering you a chance to respond before we publish. The story runs tomorrow regardless, but you deserve to know what's coming. Alexander sat down hard on the half-finished floor, splinters digging into his palms. Send me everything. I'll email you the relevant documents. You have until 6 p.m. to comment. The line went dead. For several minutes, Alexander sat there, phone in hand, trying to process what he'd just heard. Clara wouldn't do that. The woman who'd stood in her doorway and told him to leave her alone, who'd called him a coward and meant it, who'd lost everything because of him. She wouldn't turn around and profit from the wreckage. Would she? His laptop was buried under renovation supplies in the bedroom. He dug it out with shaking hands and opened his email. Rachel's message was already there, the subject line reading simply, "Evidence." Alexander clicked it open. The first attachment was a bank statement showing deposits into Clara Whitmore's account. £5,000 from News UK on March 12th, £12,000 from Associated Newspapers on March 26th, £8,000 from Bauer Media on April 3rd. The dates went back to 2 weeks after Alexander had shown up at her flat in Camden. The second attachment was an email chain between Clara and an editor at The Sun. "Thanks for the new photos. The ones of him at the flower stand are perfect, very authentic. Can you get us anything from inside his car? Our readers love behind-the-scenes royal stuff." Clara's response, sent the next day, "I'll see what I have. How much for the full set? We can go 15,000 for exclusives. 20 if you have anything really intimate. Deal." Alexander felt bile rising in his throat. He scrolled through more emails, each one worse than the last. Clara negotiating prices for stories. Clara describing their private conversations in clinical detail for ghost-written articles. Clara sending photographs he didn't even know she'd taken. The final attachment was a draft article scheduled to run in Heat magazine the following week. Clara tells all, "My secret nights with the fallen prince." He couldn't read past the headline. Alexander closed the laptop and walked outside into cold Cornish air, his lungs refusing to expand properly. The ocean stretched out gray and endless, indifferent to the fact that everything he'd believed about the past 6 months had just inverted itself. She'd been using him. Not at the beginning, maybe. Not when they'd met at the flower stand or sat in the cafe drinking terrible coffee. But somewhere between his public declaration and her move to Edinburgh, Clara Whitmore had decided that if her life was going to be destroyed anyway, she might as well profit from the destruction. And he'd given her everything she needed. His phone rang again. Marcus this time. "Sir, I just got a call from a Times journalist asking me to verify." "I know. You've seen the evidence?" "Yes." Marcus was silent for a moment. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. There's nothing to do." "Alexander, if this is true, you have grounds to sue her for... For what, Marcus?" "Telling the truth? Every conversation she sold actually happened. Every photograph she leaked, I was actually in. She didn't fabricate anything. She just monetized it. That doesn't make it right." "No, but it makes it legal." Alexander hung up and sat on the cottage steps, watching seagulls fight over scraps near the cliff edge. His mind kept circling back to that moment in Claire's doorway when she'd told him to leave. The anger in her eyes, the pain. Had it all been performance? Had she already been negotiating with tabloids while she stood there calling him a coward? Or had the anger been real and the exploitation came later, born from desperation or rage or simple financial necessity? He didn't know which possibility hurt more. By noon, his phone was exploding with messages. Sarah demanding to know if he'd seen the Times story. His lawyer asking if he wanted to pursue legal action. Several journalists offering him obscene amounts of money for his side of the story. And one message from a number he'd deleted months ago but still recognized. His mother. "We need to talk. Call me." Alexander stared at those 4 words for a full minute before dialing. Queen Consort Catherine answered on the first ring. "Have you seen it?" "Yes, then you understand the situation." "What situation is that, Mother?" Catherine's voice was tight with controlled fury. "That woman has been selling lies about you for months, and now the palace is being dragged back into the scandal you created. Sebastian is being asked about your mental health in interviews. Your father is being questioned about family dysfunction. We thought this nightmare was over, and you've resurrected it." "I didn't resurrect anything. You chose her, Alexander. You destroyed your engagement, humiliated this family, and walked away from your responsibilities for a woman who's been treating you like a commodity. So yes, you resurrected it." Alexander closed his eyes. "What do you want from me?" "An interview, public, controlled. You condemn her exploitation, reaffirm your respect for the institution you left, and make it clear that your choices were yours alone. You take responsibility and you cut her off at the knees." "Why would I do that?" "Because if you don't, she'll keep selling stories. She'll publish a book. She'll do interview tours, she'll spend the next decade dining out on your mistakes while the monarchy bleeds credibility. And if I do the interview, you'll what? Welcome me back? Catherine laughed, cold and sharp. Don't be naive. You're never coming back. But you can stop making our lives harder. That's what you owe us. I don't owe you anything. You owe Evelyn. You owe Sebastian. You owe everyone whose life you've complicated with your selfishness. The line went dead. Alexander sat there with the phone against his ear, listening to silence, feeling the trap closing around him from all sides. If he stayed quiet, Clara would keep profiting from his destruction, and the palace would keep bleeding. If he fought back publicly, he'd become exactly what the tabloids wanted, a bitter ex-lover trading accusations with the woman he'd claimed to love. There was no good choice, only damage control. That evening, Alexander called Rachel driving back. I'll give you a statement. Go ahead. Alexander took a breath. I'm disappointed to learn that someone I cared about has chosen to profit from a difficult period in both our lives. I won't speculate on her motivations, but I hope she finds whatever she's looking for. As for me, I'm focused on building a life that doesn't require royal titles or media attention. I wish everyone involved peace and privacy going forward. That's it? That's it. Rachel sounded almost disappointed. You're not angry? Not going to call her a liar or a gold digger? No. Why not? Because she's not lying, and calling her names won't change anything. The story ran the next morning with the headline, Clara's Betrayal, How the Flower Girl Cashed In on Royal Romance. The details were worse in print. The Times had receipts for everything, photos of Clara meeting with editors in expensive restaurants, testimony from friends saying she'd joked about retiring on Prince money, screenshots of messages where she'd strategized which stories to sell, when for maximum impact. The one that broke something in Alexander was an interview quote from one of her Edinburgh friends. She said he was easier to exploit because he was so desperate to be seen as normal. Like, he wanted so badly to believe someone could love him for himself that he ignored all the red flags. The friend continued. Clara felt bad about it at first, but then she figured he'd already ruined her life anyway. Might as well get paid. Alexander read the article 3 times, searching for some detail that would make it less devastating. Some indication that Clara had hesitated or felt conflicted or tried to stop herself. There was nothing. The media response was instantaneous and brutal. The same outlets that had defended Alexander's choice to walk away now crucified him for his judgment. Psychologists appeared on news programs analyzing his need for validation. Political commentators used him as evidence that the monarchy was right to maintain strict protocols around relationships. And Clara went silent. No statement, no apology, no denial. She just disappeared back into whatever life she'd built in Edinburgh, presumably with a much healthier bank account than she'd had before. 3 days after the story broke, Alexander received a visitor. He heard the car pull up outside the cottage and assumed it was Marcus checking on him. Instead, when he opened the door, Evelyn Carrington stood on his threshold, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. Lady Evelyn, he said, too stunned for anything more articulate. Just Evelyn now, actually. Got married last month, took James's name, I heard. Congratulations. Can I come in? Alexander stepped aside. The cottage looked like exactly what it was, a half-finished renovation project occupied by someone who'd forgotten how to care about appearances. Evelyn took it in with one sweeping glance and sat on the only chair that wasn't covered in tools. You look terrible. Thank you. I didn't mean it as an insult. You just... She gestured vaguely. You look like someone who's been gutted. That's accurate. Evelyn studied him with an expression he couldn't read. I came because I wanted to see if you were okay, and because I thought you might need to hear something. What's that? I forgive you. Alexander blinked. What? For the humiliation, the public disaster, all of it. She leaned forward, her voice steady. I was angry for a long time. Furious, actually. You made me look like a fool in front of the entire country. But then I met James and I realized something. What? That marrying you would have destroyed us both. You would have resented me for being part of the cage. I would have resented you for never really choosing me. We would have had a perfectly civil, perfectly miserable life. Alexander's throat was tight. I'm sorry I hurt you, I know. And I'm sorry I didn't see how badly you were suffering. She paused. But Alexander, you need to understand something. What Clara did to you? That's not worse than what you did to yourself. What are you talking about? You spent your entire life letting other people define who you were. The palace told you to be the perfect heir, so you were. Your parents told you to marry me, so you agreed. Clara told you that you were worth loving as a normal person, so you believed her. Evelyn's voice was gentle but unyielding. You've never actually decided who you are. You just keep reacting to whoever's in front of you. That's not true, isn't it? You walked away from the palace because Clara made you feel real. Now Clara's betrayed you, and you're hiding in Cornwall feeling sorry for yourself. What happens next, Alexander? Who decides what you do now? The question hung in the air like smoke. I don't know, Alexander said finally. Then figure it out. Not because someone told you to, not because it'll make good headlines or bad headlines or any headlines at all. Figure out who you actually are when no one's watching. She stood, smoothing her skirt. I should go. James is waiting in the car. He doesn't think I should be here. Why did you come? Because you're not a bad person. You're just a lost one. And I thought maybe hearing that from someone you hurt might help. After she left, Alexander sat in the cottage's growing darkness, turning Evelyn's words over in his mind. She was right. About all of it. He'd spent 32 years as a symbol, 6 months as Clara's escape fantasy, and the past 4 months as a victim of his own terrible judgment. But he'd never spent a single day as himself. Because he didn't know who that was. The realization should have been devastating. Instead, it felt almost clarifying, like finding the bottom of a hole he'd been falling down for years. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. Alexander Beaumont? Yes, this is Detective Inspector Sarah Moss with the Metropolitan Police. I'm calling about Clara Whitmore. Alexander's stomach dropped. What about her? We've arrested her on suspicion of fraud and extortion. She's been selling fabricated text messages and doctored photographs to tabloids. Some of the conversations she claimed you had never actually happened. Alexander stood up so fast his chair fell over. What? We've been investigating for 2 weeks based on a tip from one of the publications. They became suspicious when details in her stories contradicted each other. When we seized her devices, we found evidence she'd been creating fake messages using photo editing software. But the bank transfers were real. I saw them. The transfers were real. The stories were partially fabricated. She mixed genuine details with invented ones to make the lies more believable. Inspector Moss paused. Mr. Beaumont, we need you to come to London to provide testimony about which conversations actually occurred and which ones didn't. Alexander sat back down slowly, his mind reeling. So she didn't just sell our story. She invented parts of it. Apparently. And several publications are now facing libel concerns because they printed fabrications as fact. Jesus Christ. We'll need you at the station by Friday. Bring any records of actual communication you had with Ms. Whitmore. Texts, emails, anything that can help us establish what's real. The line went dead. Alexander sat in the dark cottage, trying to process this new layer of betrayal. Clara hadn't just exploited what they'd had. She'd invented a version of their relationship that was more salacious, more dramatic, more marketable than the truth. She'd turned him into a character in a story she was writing for profit. And the worst part was, he couldn't even be properly angry, because underneath the shock and hurt was something else. Relief. If Clara had fabricated parts of their story, then maybe the real relationship hadn't been as foolish as it felt. Maybe he hadn't been quite as gullible as the world thought. Maybe there was a difference between being naive and being deliberately deceived by someone who'd gotten very good at lying. It didn't excuse his choices, didn't undo the damage, but it meant he wasn't entirely the idiot everyone believed him to be. He called Marcus. I need to go to London. I heard. I'll have a car ready tomorrow morning. Marcus, how did you know? The inspector called me first. Wanted to verify your current address. Marcus paused. Sir, this changes things. If Clara fabricated evidence, the narrative shifts. You're not just a fool who fell for a con artist. You're a victim of actual fraud. I don't want to be a victim. Then what do you want to be? Alexander looked around the cottage, at the half-finished repairs, and the life he'd been building from scraps and silence. Someone who stops letting other people write his story. The next morning, Alexander climbed into the back of Marcus's car for the first time in months and watched Cornwall disappear in the rearview mirror. London appeared like a threat on the horizon, all gray sky and dense architecture, the city that had chewed him up and spat him out twice now. The Metropolitan Police Station was in Southwark, a brutalist building that smelled like industrial cleaner and desperation. Inspector Moss met him in a conference room with walls the color of depression. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Beaumont." She was younger than Alexander had expected, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who'd seen enough liars to spot them at 50 paces. "Walk me through your relationship with Clara Whitmore from the beginning." For 3 hours, Alexander recounted every conversation he could remember. The flower stand, the cafe, the bridge. Inspector Moss took notes, occasionally stopping him to clarify details or ask about specific dates. Then she slid a folder across the table. "These are messages Ms. Whitmore sold to the Sun, claiming they were from you." Alexander opened the folder. The first screenshot showed a text conversation allegedly between him and Clara. "I can't stop thinking about you. When I'm at palace events, all I see is your face. Being with you is the only time I feel like myself. I'd give up everything for you. The crown means nothing compared to what we have." Alexander stared at the messages, his chest tight. "I never sent these." "You're certain?" "Completely certain." "I was careful about what I put in writing. We mostly talked in person." Inspector Moss nodded. "Ms. Whitmore's phone shows she created these using a messaging app that lets you fake conversations. She screenshotted them and sold them as genuine." "Why would she do that?" "Money, mostly. But also," Moss hesitated. "In her interview, she said you'd ruined her life anyway, so she figured she might as well control the story. She wanted you to suffer the way she'd suffered. Did it work?" Inspector Moss's expression softened slightly. "I'd say yes." They went through 17 more fabricated conversations, each one more intimate and damaging than the last. Clara had created an entire fictional relationship where Alexander was obsessed, manipulative, and emotionally unstable. She'd sold that fiction to publications that had printed it as truth. The real betrayal, Alexander realized, wasn't that she'd sold their story. It was that she'd rewritten it to make him into a monster. "What happens now?" he asked. "We charge her with fraud. The publications sue her for the money they paid based on false information. You have the option to file a civil suit for defamation." "Do I have to?" "No. But Mr. Beaumont, she's destroyed your reputation based on lies. You have every right to fight back." Alexander thought about the past 6 months. The humiliation, the isolation, the constant weight of public judgment based on a story that was only half true. Then he thought about Clara standing in her Camden doorway, eyes wet with genuine pain, telling him he'd ruined her life. "Some of what she did was real," he said quietly. "The anger, the hurt. I earned that. That doesn't give her the right to fabricate evidence." "No. But prosecuting her won't undo the damage. It'll just create more headlines, more drama, more years of my life defined by this disaster." "So you're just going to let it go?" Alexander looked at Inspector Moss. "I'm going to testify to what actually happened, help you build your case. But I'm not suing her. I'm done letting Clara Whitmore occupy space in my life, even if it means people still believe her lies. Especially then, because the people who matter will know the truth eventually, and the people who don't matter can believe whatever they want." Inspector Moss studied him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Honestly? A spoiled rich kid playing victim. But you seem..." She searched for the word. "Tired. I am tired. Tired of performing. Tired of managing narratives. Tired of caring what strangers think about my life. That's probably the healthiest thing I've heard in this building all year." Alexander left the police station feeling hollowed out, but strangely lighter. Marcus was waiting by the car, scanning the street for cameras out of habit. "Where to, sir?" Alexander looked at London stretching out around him, the city that had been both his prison and his liberation. Somewhere in this sprawling mess of humanity, his family was going about their royal duties without him. Evelyn was building a life with someone who actually chose her. Clara was sitting in a holding cell, coming to terms with consequences. And he was free. Not the dramatic freedom of his rainy declaration 6 months ago, not the fantasy freedom of secret meetings with a flower girl, but the quiet, terrifying freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose. "Take me to Sarah's flat," he said. "I need to figure out what comes next." The scandal broke wider the following week. Clara Whitmore was formally charged with multiple counts of fraud. Publications scrambled to retract stories and issue corrections. The palace released a terse statement expressing sympathy for Alexander's situation without actually inviting him back into the family. And the media narrative shifted. Suddenly, Alexander wasn't the fool who'd thrown away a kingdom for a con artist. He was a victim of sophisticated deception, a man who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to be exploited. Public opinion swung back in his direction with whiplash speed. Alexander ignored all of it. He stayed at Sarah's flat for 2 weeks, helping her organize files for the veterans' charity and learning how to exist as a private citizen. Then he returned to Cornwall and finished the cottage repairs. Then he accepted a permanent position with the charity, managing outreach programs for former service members struggling with civilian life. The work was hard and underpaid and utterly unglamorous. It was also the first thing Alexander had ever done that felt like it mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with his last name. 6 months after Clara's arrest, Alexander stood in a community center in Manchester, watching a former Royal Marine named David talk to a group of veterans about his transition out of service. David had been homeless for 2 years before the charity connected him with housing and job training. Now he was employed, stable, and helping others navigate the same journey. After the session, David approached Alexander. "Mate, I just wanted to say thanks for the program. Changed my life." Alexander shook his hand. "You did the work. We just opened doors." "Yeah, but you didn't have to open them." David paused. "I know who you used to be before all this, and I just think it's decent, that you're doing something real instead of just hiding." "I'm not sure I had much choice. We always have choices. You could have stayed in that cottage feeling sorry for yourself. Instead, you're here. That counts." After David left, Alexander stood in the empty community center, surrounded by folding chairs and motivational posters, and felt something shift in his chest. For the first time since he'd walked away from the palace, he wasn't running from something. He was moving towards something. It wasn't redemption, wasn't absolution, wasn't a happy ending tied up with narrative satisfaction. It was just work, real work, the kind that helped people without requiring cameras or public statements or carefully managed optics. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Your brother wants to meet. Says it's important." Alexander stared at the message, feeling old instincts rise up. The urge to analyze what Sebastian wanted, to prepare defensive arguments, to protect himself from whatever new attack was coming. Then he deleted the message and went back to packing up chairs. Whatever Sebastian wanted, it could wait. Alexander had finally found something that mattered more than his family's approval, and he wasn't giving it up for anyone. Alexander was reviewing grant applications in the charity office when Marcus appeared in the doorway looking like he'd seen a ghost. It was a Thursday afternoon in November, rain hammering against the windows hard enough to rattle the glass. The office smelled like coffee and old carpet, and Alexander had been working for 6 hours straight trying to secure funding for a housing program. Marcus didn't knock, didn't wait for acknowledgement, just walked in and closed the door behind him with the kind of deliberate care that meant something catastrophic had happened. "Your father's dying." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He set down his pen slowly, carefully, like any sudden movement might shatter the moment into something worse. "What?" "Stroke. Massive. They found him in his study 2 hours ago." Marcus's voice was flat, delivering information the way he'd been trained to deliver battlefield intelligence. "He's at King Edward VII Hospital. They're saying hours, not days." Alexander's hands started shaking. He pressed them flat against the desk. "Is he conscious?" "In and out. He's asked for you." The room tilted. Alexander stood up, sat back down, stood again. His brain couldn't process the information fast enough. His father, the man who'd spent 63 years preparing to be king, the man who'd called Alexander unfit and selfish and weak, was dying and wanted to see him. When? Now. "There's a car waiting." Alexander looked at the grant application spread across his desk, at the life he'd built from ruins and stubbornness, and felt the past pulling him back like gravity. He could refuse, could stay in this office and let his father die without him, could maintain the boundary he'd fought so hard to establish. But underneath the anger and resentment and years of suffocation was something simpler and more devastating. He was still his father's son. "Let's go." The drive to London took 3 hours through relentless rain. Marcus drove in silence while Alexander sat in the back seat watching England blur past, his mind caught between memory and dread. He kept thinking about the last time he'd seen his father, standing in that palace study being told he was a disgrace. The way Edward's face had gone purple with rage. The way his voice had shaken when he'd said Alexander wasn't fit to be part of the family. That had been 18 months ago. 18 months of silence, broken only by formal legal communications about the separation of assets and titles. 18 months of Alexander building a new identity while his father pretended he'd never existed. And now Edward was dying, and Alexander was speeding toward him like the past 18 months had been a dream he could wake up from. His phone buzzed continuously. Sebastian, his mother, palace officials. He ignored them all until Sarah's name appeared. He answered, "I heard. How are you holding up?" "I don't know. I can't tell if I'm supposed to feel sad or angry or relieved or what. You're allowed to feel all of it." Sarah's voice was steady, grounding. "He's your father. That doesn't stop being true just because he hurt you." "What if I get there and he dies before I can say anything?" "Then you say it anyway. The dead can't interrupt, so you might finally get a word in." Despite everything, Alexander almost smiled. "I'll call you after." Alexander, whatever happens in that hospital room, you don't owe him anything. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not absolution. You get to decide what this means. What if I don't know what it means? Then you sit with that uncertainty until you do. The hospital was a fortress of security and journalists. Marcus navigated them with grim efficiency, pulling the car into a private entrance where palace security was waiting. Alexander climbed out into cold London air that tasted like exhaust and rain, and let himself be escorted through corridors that smelled like antiseptic and death. His mother was waiting outside the private suite, looking older than Alexander had ever seen her. Catherine's perfect posture had collapsed into something hunched and fragile. When she saw Alexander, something cracked in her expression. "You came. You said he asked for me." "He did." Catherine's voice was rough, like she'd been crying for hours. "He keeps saying your name over and over. Is he lucid?" "Sometimes." Then he slips away. She reached for Alexander's hand, then stopped herself. "The doctors say it could happen anytime. Can I see him?" Catherine nodded and opened the door. The room was dim and full of machines that beeped with mechanical indifference. Edward lay in the hospital bed looking smaller than Alexander had ever seen him, his face gray and slack on one side, his breathing labored. Sebastian sat in a chair by the window, his expression unreadable. When he saw Alexander, he stood. "So you actually showed up." Sebastian's voice carried none of its usual venom, just exhaustion. "He's my father, too." "Is he?" "Last I checked, you walked away from this family. I walked away from the institution, not from him." Sebastian laughed, bitter and sharp. "You really believe that, don't you? That you can separate the man from the crown?" He gestured at Edward's unconscious form. "Look at him, Alexander. He is the crown. There's nothing underneath. You're wrong." "Am I?" "Because I've spent the last 18 months becoming exactly what he wanted you to be. The dutiful son. The perfect heir. And you know what I've learned? He never saw me either. He just saw another piece on the chessboard." Before Alexander could respond, Edward stirred. His eyes opened, unfocused and confused, searching the room until they landed on Alexander. The word came out slurred and broken. "Alexander." Alexander moved to the bedside without thinking. "I'm here." Edward's hand reached out, trembling. Alexander took it, feeling how cold and fragile his father had become. This man who had once seemed invincible, who had ruled his family with absolute authority, was reduced to this. A dying king grasping for his exiled son. "I was wrong." The words were barely audible. Alexander leaned closer. "What?" Edward's eyes focused with obvious effort. "Wrong about you, wrong about everything. Dad, don't. Save your strength." "No." Edward's grip tightened. "Need to say this. While I can." Sebastian stood abruptly and left the room. Catherine stayed by the door, silent and watching. Edward's breathing rattled. "You were braver than me. Walked away from the cage. I never could. You didn't have a choice. Everyone has choices." Edward's face contorted with pain or regret or both. I chose duty over happiness, over you, over everything real, and now I'm dying having lived a life that wasn't mine. Alexander felt his throat closing. You were a good king. I was a terrible father. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. Edward's eyes started to drift closed. Stay with me, Alexander said, hearing the desperation in his own voice. Dad, stay with me. Edward's eyes opened again. Proud of you, building something real, being someone real. I don't know who that is yet. You will. Edward's breath hitched. Just don't take 60 years to figure it out. His eyes closed. The machine's rhythm changed, faster and more urgent. Catherine moved to the bedside, pressing a call button. Within seconds, doctors flooded the room, shouting medical terms Alexander didn't understand. Someone pulled him away from the bed. He watched them work on his father's body, performing a choreography of desperation that everyone knew was futile. The machines flatlined at 4:37 p.m. King Edward was pronounced dead at 4:41. Alexander stood against the wall, his father's last words echoing in his head, feeling something fundamental shift in the architecture of his identity. The man who had defined him through expectation and disappointment, who had represented everything Alexander had fled, was gone. And his last act had been forgiveness. Catherine collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Sebastian returned to the room, saw the flat lines on the monitors, and turned away without a word. The doctors began their post-mortem procedures with quiet efficiency. Alexander walked out into the corridor and kept walking. Through the hospital, past security, out into the rain. He didn't have a destination, didn't have a plan, just movement, his feet carrying him through London streets while his mind tried to process what had just happened. His phone rang. Marcus. Sir, where are you? I don't know, walking. The palace is asking about funeral arrangements. They need to know if you're participating. Tell them I need time. Alexander, your father just died. They need answers now. Then tell them I'll call back. He hung up and kept walking. Rain soaked through his coat, through his shirt, into his bones. People hurried past with umbrellas, oblivious to the fact that a king had just died and his exiled son was falling apart on a street corner in Kensington. Alexander's phone buzzed with notifications, news outlets breaking the story. Condolences from people he hadn't spoken to in years. A statement from the palace announcing Edward's death and Sebastian's immediate ascension as king. And one text from a number he didn't recognize. I heard about your father. I'm sorry. It took him a moment to place the phrasing. Then he realized. Clara. She'd been released from prison 2 months ago after serving a reduced sentence for fraud. Her lawyer had negotiated a deal where she paid back the money and avoided serious jail time. Alexander had deliberately not followed the case, had forced himself not to care what happened to her. And now she was texting him condolences. He stared at the message for a long time, rain running down the screen, blurring the words. Part of him wanted to respond, to say thank you or go to hell, or I forgive you or I hate you, or any of the 1,000 things that had been trapped in his chest since the day he'd learned about her betrayal. Instead, he deleted the message and turned off his phone. The funeral was scheduled for 10 days later at Westminster Abbey. Alexander spent those 10 days in a fog of logistics and memory. He stayed at Sarah's flat, avoiding the palace, avoiding his family, avoiding everything except the basic mechanics of survival. Sarah didn't push, just made sure he ate and slept and showed up to the meetings that couldn't be avoided. Sebastian called once. You're coming to the funeral. It wasn't a question. Yes. Good. Because if you don't, it'll be a story. And I'd rather not spend Dad's funeral answering questions about our family dysfunction. How are you? Sebastian was silent for a long moment. I'm king. How do you think I am? The line went dead. The night before the funeral, Alexander sat in Sarah's kitchen drinking whiskey and staring at a blank piece of paper. He'd been asked to prepare remarks, a eulogy from the prodigal son, words that would be dissected and analyzed and turned into headlines. He had no idea what to say. Sarah sat down across from him. You could tell the truth. Which truth? That he was a complicated man who hurt people? That he spent his life in service to an institution that destroyed him? That his last words to me were an apology for choices he couldn't undo? All of it. They'll crucify me. They already did. You survived. Alexander looked at the blank paper. What if I can't do this? Then you don't. You show up, You stand there and you let someone else speak. But Alexander, if there's anything you need to say to him, this is your last chance. After tomorrow, the narrative is locked. He becomes history. What if I don't want to be part of that history? Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Then you're not. But I think you need to decide that for yourself, not because you're scared of what people will think. Alexander wrote the eulogy at 3 a.m, fueled by whiskey and grief and the kind of clarity that only comes from exhaustion. He didn't try to make it palatable, didn't soften the edges or manage the optics, just wrote what was true. Westminster Abbey was full of people Alexander had once known and now barely recognized. Heads of state, royal families from other countries, politicians and diplomats and aristocrats wearing grief like expensive suits. He sat in the front row between Sebastian and Catherine, feeling like an imposter at his own father's funeral. The service was everything Edward would have wanted: formal, dignified, perfectly choreographed, hymns that meant nothing and prayers that changed nothing. When it was Alexander's turn to speak, he walked to the pulpit feeling every eye in the abbey watching him. He looked out at the congregation, at the coffin draped in the royal standard, at his mother's devastated face. Then he began. My father was a man who lived his entire life in service to an idea: the crown, the institution, the weight of history and tradition that sat on his shoulders from the moment he was born. He was good at it, brilliant even. He knew exactly what was expected of him, and he delivered it flawlessly for 6 decades. Alexander paused, letting the words settle. But I don't think he was happy. A ripple went through the congregation. Catherine's eyes widened. Sebastian stiffened beside her. Alexander continued, his voice steady. I don't think any of us in this family know how to be happy because we were taught that happiness is selfish, that duty comes first, that personal desires are weaknesses to be suppressed. My father believed that with every fiber of his being, and it made him a remarkable king, but it made him a distant father, a lonely husband, a man who spent his life playing a role so convincingly that he forgot there was a person underneath. Someone in the back coughed. The sound echoed through the massive space. In his final moments, my father told me he was wrong. Wrong about me. Wrong about the choices I made. Wrong about sacrificing everything real for the sake of appearances. I don't know if he meant it or if it was just the morphine talking. But I choose to believe he meant it, because it's the only conversation we ever had where he spoke as my father instead of as the king. Alexander gripped the pulpit. I loved him. I resented him. I fled from everything he represented and spent 18 months trying to build a life he would never understand. And now he's gone, and I'm standing here realizing that we wasted decades not knowing each other because we were both too afraid to be honest, too afraid to admit that the weight of the crown was crushing us, too afraid to say that we were tired. His voice broke slightly. He didn't try to hide it. So if there's anything I want people to remember about Edward Beaumont, it's this. He was human. Flawed and complicated and trapped by circumstances he didn't choose. He did his best with an impossible situation, and in the end, he tried to tell his son that it was okay to choose differently. Alexander looked directly at his mother. I hope we can all learn from that before it's too late. He stepped down from the pulpit. The abbey was absolutely silent. No one moved. No one breathed. Alexander walked back to his seat, feeling the weight of 1,000 judgments settling onto his shoulders, and realized he didn't care. He told the truth. Finally. Completely. Whatever happened next, at least it would be honest. After the service, the reception was held at Buckingham Palace. Alexander hadn't set foot in the building since the night he'd run out into the rain 18 months ago. Walking through those corridors again felt like visiting a museum of his former life. Everything was familiar and alien at once. Sebastian found him standing in the corridor outside their father's old study. That was quite a eulogy. I meant every word. I know. Sebastian's voice was tight. That's what makes it worse. Worse than what? Than if you'd lied. If you'd given some sanitized tribute about duty and service, everyone could have ignored it. But you told the truth, and now people are going to spend years debating whether Dad was a tragic figure or just a man who made bad choices. Maybe he was both. Sebastian turned to face him fully. You know what your problem is, Alexander? You think being honest makes you brave, but sometimes honesty is just selfishness in a different package. You gotta say what you needed to say, and the rest of us have to deal with the fallout. What fallout? Do you have any idea what the press is going to do with that speech? The psychoanalysis? The think pieces about royal family dysfunction? You just gave them ammunition for months. Good. Maybe it's time people stop pretending we're perfect. We're not trying to be perfect. We're trying to survive. Sebastian's voice rose. This institution is hanging by a thread. Public support is at an all-time low. Half the country thinks we're irrelevant, and you just stood up in Westminster Abbey and confirmed every criticism they've ever made. I confirmed that we're human. We can't afford to be human. That's the whole point. Alexander looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw the same exhaustion he'd felt for years. Sebastian's jaw was tight. His hands were clenched. His eyes held the kind of desperation that comes from drowning slowly while everyone watches. You sound like Dad. Maybe Dad was right. Was he? Alexander stepped closer. Are you happy, Sebastian? Being king? Having your entire life mapped out by protocol? Never getting to make a single choice that's actually yours? It doesn't matter if I'm happy. That's exactly what he would have said. Sebastian's face went red. Don't you dare compare us. I stayed. I did my duty. I didn't run away the first time things got difficult. You're right. You stayed. And look at you. You're 30 years old and you already look 50. You're King of England and you're miserable. So congratulations, Sebastian. You won. Get out. I'm already gone. Alexander turned and walked away, leaving his brother standing alone in the corridor. He made it to the palace entrance before Catherine caught up with him. Alexander, wait. He stopped. I'm done, Mother. Done with this family, done with this institution, done pretending any of it matters. It does matter. To who? To you? To Sebastian? To the historians who will write about us when we're dead? Alexander's voice was raw. Because it doesn't matter to me anymore. I spent 32 years suffocating in this place, and I'm not coming back. Catherine's composure finally cracked. You think you're the only one who suffered? You think I wanted this life? I was 23 when I married your father, 23 years old, and I gave up everything I wanted to become queen consort. I've spent 40 years smiling through events I hated, supporting causes I didn't care about, being the perfect wife to a man who loved the crown more than he loved me. Tears ran down her face, smearing her makeup. But I stayed. I did my duty. I didn't abandon my family the moment it became inconvenient. Is that what you think I did? Abandoned you? What else would you call it? Alexander felt something break open in his chest. I call it surviving. I call it choosing life over slow death. I call it refusing to spend the next 40 years becoming exactly what you just described. Catherine stared at him. So what? You're just going to disappear? Pretend we don't exist? No. I'm going to build something real, something that matters. And when I look back on my life, I won't have to wonder if I wasted it playing a role someone else wrote for me. And what about us? What about you? You made your choices, Mother. You chose the institution. You chose duty. You chose to sacrifice your happiness and call it noble. I'm choosing differently, even if it means losing your family. Alexander looked at her, at the woman who'd raised him and criticized him and never quite understood him, and felt the full weight of what he was saying. You were never really my family. You were my wardens, and I'm done being imprisoned. He walked out of Buckingham Palace for the last time, down the steps where he'd made his rainy declaration, past the gates where tourists took photographs, into the London evening that tasted like freedom and ashes. Marcus was waiting by the car. Where to, sir? Home. Cornwall? No. Alexander climbed into the back seat. Manchester, the charity office. That's home now. They drove through London as evening turned to night, the city lights blurring past like stars. Alexander's phone exploded with notifications. Journalists wanting comments on his eulogy. Palace officials demanding he retract his statements. Social media erupting into debate about whether he'd been brave or cruel. He turned off his phone and watched England scroll past, feeling lighter and heavier than he'd ever felt before. Sarah called when they were an hour outside London. He answered on speaker. You okay? No, but I will be. That eulogy was either the bravest or stupidest thing you've ever done. Probably both. The palace is furious. Sebastian's already released a statement distancing himself from your remarks. Good for Sebastian. Alexander. Sarah's voice was serious. You just burned every bridge back to that world. There's no coming back from this. I know. And you're okay with that? Alexander thought about his father's last words, about Catherine crying in the palace hallway, about Sebastian drowning in duty, about the life he would have lived if he'd stayed. Yeah, I'm okay with it. Then I'm proud of you. After they hung up, Marcus spoke from the front seat. Sir, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you regret any of it? The engagement. Clara, leaving. Alexander watched the motorway lights streak past. Every single day. But I'd do it all again anyway. Why? Because regret means you're still alive. It means you made choices instead of just existing. And I'd rather live with regret than die having never chosen anything. They drove in silence for a while. Then Marcus said quietly, Your father would have understood that. Eventually. Maybe. Or maybe he died still thinking I was a coward. Does it matter? Alexander considered the question. No, I don't think it does anymore. They reached Manchester just after midnight. The charity office was dark and empty, exactly as Alexander had left it. He climbed out of the car and stood on the pavement, looking up at the building that represented everything he'd become after walking away from everything he'd been. This was his life now, not palace corridors and state dinners, not royal obligations and carefully managed appearances. Just work that mattered, and people who needed help, and the slow, unglamorous process of building something real. Marcus opened the trunk and pulled out Alexander's bag. I'll be at the hotel if you need anything. Marcus. Sir? Thank you. For staying, even after you didn't have to. Marcus's expression softened. Where else would I go? You're the only member of that family worth protecting. He drove away, leaving Alexander alone on an empty Manchester street with everything he owned in a single bag. Alexander unlocked the office and walked inside. The space smelled like old coffee and determination. He sat at his desk, surrounded by grant applications and program budgets and the infrastructure of actual purpose, and felt something settle in his chest. This was enough. Not glamorous. Not comfortable. Not the life anyone would have predicted for a former duke. But it was his. For the first time in his life, completely and irrevocably his. His phone buzzed. One last message before he'd turn it off for the night. Unknown number again. He almost ignored it, then curiosity won. The message read, I saw the eulogy. It was brave. You were right about everything. I'm sorry I couldn't see it before. No name. But Alexander knew exactly who it was. Clara. He stared at the message for a long time, his finger hovering over the delete button. Then, instead of deleting it, he typed a response. I forgive you. Not for you. For me. Because I'm done carrying anger. He hit send before he could second-guess himself. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. Finally, a response came through. Thank you. I don't deserve it, but thank you. Alexander typed back, None of us deserve anything. We just get to decide what we do with what we're given. The dots appeared one more time, then vanished. Clara didn't respond again. Alexander set his phone down and looked around the empty office. Outside, Manchester hummed with late-night traffic and lives being lived. Inside, he sat alone with the wreckage of his past and the uncertain promise of his future. Somewhere in London, his family was mourning a king and preparing for a new reign. Somewhere in Edinburgh, Claire was sitting with her own regrets. And here, in a cramped charity office in Manchester, Alexander Beaumont was finally becoming someone he could recognize in the mirror. The journey wasn't over. Wouldn't be over for years. Maybe never. But for the first time since he'd stood in that rainy palace courtyard 18 months ago, Alexander felt like he was moving in the right direction. Not running away, not running toward, just moving. Forward. Into whatever came next. His phone buzzed one final time. A news alert. Breaking. Former Duke Alexander Beaumont's shocking eulogy sparks royal crisis. Palace sources say family is divided. Alexander read the headline, then turned off his phone completely. Let them be divided. He had work to do. Alexander spent the first 6 months after the funeral doing the kind of work that doesn't make headlines. He reviewed applications from veterans struggling with PTSD He sat in community centers in cities no one visited, talking to men and women who'd served their country and been discarded like broken equipment. He learned their names, heard their stories, helped them navigate bureaucracies designed to exhaust rather than assist. It was grinding, unglamorous work that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries. But every time Alexander helped someone find housing or job training, or just someone who would listen without judgment, he felt something in his chest that had been dead for years slowly coming back to life. Purpose. Not the manufactured purpose of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and state dinners. Real purpose, earned through hours of exhausting conversation and paperwork that actually changed lives. Sarah called him every Sunday to check in. On a gray March afternoon, 6 months after Edward's funeral, she asked the question Alexander had been avoiding. Have you thought about what comes next? Alexander was in his flat, a one-bedroom apartment in Salford that smelled like damp and had heating that worked approximately half the time. He looked around at the second-hand furniture and walls that needed painting and felt something close to contentment. This is what comes next. Alexander, you're doing incredible work, but you're also 34 years old and living like a university student. At some point, you need to think bigger. Bigger how? I don't know. Maybe start your own organization. Maybe write about your experience. Maybe find a way to use your story to help people instead of just hiding from it. I'm not hiding, aren't you? The question lingered after they hung up. Alexander sat at his kitchen table drinking instant coffee and staring at the blank wall, trying to figure out if Sarah was right. Was he building a new life or just running from his old one in a different direction? The answer came a week later in the form of a letter delivered to the charity office. Heavy paper, formal script, no return address. Alexander opened it with hands that remembered opening similar envelopes in palace offices a lifetime ago. Mr. Beaumont, my name is Dr. Elena Martinez. I'm a researcher at Oxford studying the psychological impact of institutional pressure on individuals in high-profile positions. I've been following your story since your departure from royal life, and I believe your experience could provide valuable insights for others struggling with similar circumstances. I would like to invite you to speak at a symposium we're organizing on institutional trauma and personal autonomy. The event will include psychologists, former political figures, and individuals who've left restrictive organizations. Your perspective would be invaluable. I understand this may be difficult, but I also believe that sharing your truth could help others find the courage to choose themselves over institutions that are destroying them. Please consider it. Alexander read the letter 3 times. The idea of standing in front of academics and former officials talking about his failures made his skin crawl. But underneath the instinctive recoil was something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or the faint possibility that Sarah was right, that hiding was just another form of prison. He called Dr. Martinez that evening. Her voice was warm and professionally enthusiastic, the kind of academic who genuinely believed research could change lives. Thank you for calling, Mr. Beaumont. I wasn't sure you would. I'm not sure I should have, but your letter made me think. About what? About whether I'm done running. They talked for an hour. Dr. Martinez explained that the symposium would focus on the cost of institutional loyalty and the process of reclaiming individual identity. She wanted Alexander to speak about his experience leaving the royal family, but also about what came after, the rebuilding, the uncertainty, the slow process of becoming someone new. I can't promise it'll be comfortable, she said, but I can promise it'll be honest. And sometimes honest is more important than comfortable. Alexander agreed before he could talk himself out of it. The symposium was scheduled for May at Oxford's examination schools, a Gothic building that looked like it had been designed to intimidate. Alexander took the train down from Manchester on a bright spring morning, watching England bloom green and alive outside his window. Marcus had offered to drive him, but Alexander had declined. This was something he needed to do alone. The venue was packed. Academics, journalists, former politicians who'd left their parties, religious figures who'd broken from their orders, people who'd walked away from corporations and militaries and families that demanded absolute loyalty. All of them gathered to talk about the moment they'd chosen themselves over the institutions that had defined them. Alexander sat in the green room backstage, his prepared remarks in front of him, feeling his heart try to escape his ribcage. Dr. Martinez found him 20 minutes before he was scheduled to speak. How are you holding up? Terrified. Good. That means you still care. She sat beside him. Can I tell you something, please? Most of the people in that auditorium are here because they've been where you are. They know what it costs to walk away. They know the guilt and the doubt and the nights you wake up wondering if you made a terrible mistake. You're not performing for them. You're just telling them they're not alone. What if I don't know what to say? Then say that. Say you're still figuring it out. That's more valuable than false certainty. When Alexander walked onto the stage, the applause was polite and scattered. He looked out at 200 faces and saw recognition in many of them. People who understood what it meant to be defined by something larger than yourself and then have to figure out who you were without it. He set his prepared remarks aside and spoke from his chest. My name is Alexander Beaumont. For 32 years, I was Duke Alexander, fifth in line to the British throne, a symbol of continuity and tradition. And for every one of those years, I was dying inside. The auditorium went quiet. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean, I was actually dying, piece by piece. Every time I attended a state dinner I didn't care about. Every time I gave a speech someone else wrote. Every time I stood next to a woman I was supposed to marry and felt absolutely nothing. I was being erased, and I told myself it was noble, that sacrifice was duty, that personal happiness was selfish. Alexander's voice steadied. Then I met someone who saw past the performance, who treated me like a person instead of a position. And for the first time in my life, I felt real. So I made a choice. I walked away from the palace, renounced my titles, gave up everything I'd been raised to value. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. And I destroyed a lot of people in the process. I humiliated a woman who didn't deserve it. I broke my family's trust. I gave ammunition to everyone who wanted to tear down the institution I'd left. I was selfish and reckless and convinced that my freedom mattered more than anyone else's pain. Someone in the front row leaned forward. The woman I thought I loved turned out to be exploiting me, selling stories to tabloids, fabricating conversations, using my desperation to feel normal as a commodity she could profit from. And when I found out, I felt vindicated, like her betrayal proved I'd been right to leave, that everyone around me was corrupt or manipulative or trapped. But that was a lie too. Clara Whitmore didn't betray me because she was evil. She betrayed me because I'd ruined her life without her consent. I dragged her into my personal rebellion and then acted surprised when she tried to salvage something from the wreckage. She was surviving, just like I was. Alexander looked directly at the audience. The truth is, there are no heroes in my story, just people making impossible choices in impossible situations. My father spent 60 years serving an institution that prevented him from being a real person. My mother sacrificed her entire identity to be the perfect consort. My brother inherited a crown he never wanted and now has to pretend it's a gift. And I ran away from all of it, telling myself I was brave when really I was just desperate. His voice cracked slightly. I don't regret leaving, but I regret how I did it. I regret not having the courage to be honest earlier. I regret waiting until I was so broken that the only option was scorched earth. I regret hurting people who were also trapped, just in different cages. He took a breath. So what did I learn? That freedom isn't free. That choosing yourself costs everyone around you something. That there's no clean way to leave an institution designed to consume you. And that even after you escape, you spend years figuring out who you are without the identity you rejected. I'm still figuring it out. I work for a veterans charity. I live in a flat with terrible heating. I help people fill out paperwork and navigate systems designed to break them. It's not glamorous. It's not the fairy tale people wanted when I made my dramatic exit in the rain. But it's mine, and that has to be enough. The applause when he finished was different, louder, more sustained. People stood, not out of politeness, but recognition. Alexander walked off the stage feeling lighter and heavier than he had in months. Dr. Martinez met him backstage with tears in her eyes. That was extraordinary. That was terrifying. It was both. She handed him a bottle of water. There are about 30 people who want to talk to you. You up for it? Alexander thought about hiding, about slipping out the back exit and returning to Manchester and the anonymous safety of his one-bedroom flat. Then he thought about what he'd just said on stage, about still figuring out who he was, about the cost of honesty. Yeah, I'm up for it. He spent the next 3 hours talking to strangers who weren't strangers at all. A former CEO who'd walked away from a Fortune 500 company after realizing it was destroying his family. A woman who'd left a cult and spent a decade rebuilding an identity from scratch. A politician who'd resigned rather than vote for policies he couldn't defend. Each of them carrying their own version of the same weight. Near the end, a young man approached. He looked about 25, nervous, like he'd been working up courage for an hour. "Mr. Beaumont, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Of course." The young man's hands were shaking. "I'm supposed to get married in 3 months, arranged by my family. She's a good person, but I don't love her, and I keep thinking about your story, about how you walked away. But I'm terrified. My family will disown me, my community will reject me, I'll lose everything." Alexander recognized the desperation in his eyes, had seen it in his own mirror for years. "What do you want to do?" "I want to run, but I don't know if I'm strong enough." Alexander thought about his father's last words, about Clara's betrayal, about standing in Manchester at 3 a.m., wondering if he'd made the worst mistake of his life. You don't need to be strong. You just need to be honest. With yourself first, then with everyone else. And yeah, it's going to hurt. People are going to be angry. You're going to doubt yourself constantly. But the alternative is spending the rest of your life as someone you're not. And that's not strength. That's just slow death. The young man's eyes were wet. "What if I regret it?" "Then you regret it. But at least it'll be your regret, your choice, your life." After he left, Alexander sat alone in the empty auditorium, looking at the stage where he'd just told 200 people that he was still figuring out who he was. The admission should have felt like failure. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he'd said in years. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he'd deleted but still recognized immediately. "Clara, I watched your talk. Someone posted it online. You were right about everything. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I'm sorry anyway." Alexander stared at the message for a long time. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to maintain the boundary he'd fought so hard to establish. But another part, the part that had just spent 3 hours talking about the cost of honesty, knew that holding on to anger was just another cage. He typed back, "I forgive you. Not because you earned it, because I need to let it go." 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, "Thank you. I don't deserve it. None of us deserve anything. We just get to decide what we do with what we're given." The dots appeared again, then disappeared, then appeared one final time. "For what it's worth, I actually did care about you, before the money, before the exploitation." There was a moment when it was real. Alexander felt something loosen in his chest. "I know. I think that's what made it hurt so much." "Where are you now?" "Edinburgh, working in a florist shop, trying to rebuild without profiting from the wreckage." Alexander smiled despite everything. "That's good. You always loved flowers." "Yeah. Turns out I'm better at arranging them than selling them on street corners." He could almost hear her voice, the sharpness, the humor that had first caught his attention. "Take care of yourself, Clara. You too, Alexander. I hope you find whatever you're looking for." The conversation ended there. No dramatic reconciliation, no promises to stay in touch. Just 2 people acknowledging that they'd both survived a disaster that had nearly destroyed them. Alexander walked out of the examination schools into a warm Oxford evening. Students cycled past on their way to dinner or the library or whatever normal people did on Tuesday nights. He caught a glimpse of himself in a shop window and barely recognized the man staring back. Older, thinner, but also somehow more present than he'd been in years. His phone rang. "Sarah, I saw the video." Everyone saw the video. It's already been shared 10,000 times. Is that good or bad? Depends on what you want. If you want to disappear, it's bad. If you want to help people, it's probably the best thing you could have done. Alexander thought about the young man who'd approached him, about the 30 other conversations he'd had with people carrying their own impossible choices. "I think I want to help people." "Then you're going to need a better plan than just working at the charity forever." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Alexander, what you said today matters. But it only matters if you build something with it." "Like what?" "I don't know, a foundation, a consulting practice for people leaving restrictive institutions. A book. Something that turns your experience into a resource instead of just a cautionary tale." The idea terrified him. It also felt inevitable. "I'll think about it." Don't think too long. The world needs what you learned, even if it cost you everything to learn it. After they hung up, Alexander walked through Oxford's winding streets until he found himself standing outside a small pub. Through the window, he could see people laughing, drinking, living their normal lives. For a moment, he felt the old ache, the longing to be ordinary, to have never been Duke Alexander, to have lived a simple life without the weight of crowns and expectations. But that wasn't his story, would never be his story. His story was messier and harder and more public than he'd ever wanted. But it was also real. Painfully, devastatingly real. And maybe that was enough. He went into the pub and ordered a beer. The bartender didn't recognize him. The people at the next table talked about football without knowing they were sitting 3 feet from someone who'd been fifth in line to the throne. Alexander drank his beer and listened to conversations that had nothing to do with duty or sacrifice or institutional loyalty. When he left an hour later, night had fallen completely. He walked to the train station, bought a ticket back to Manchester, and sat on the platform watching other travelers come and go. His phone buzzed one more time. An email from Dr. Martinez. Alexander, I've been contacted by several organizations asking if you'd be willing to speak at their events. Universities, corporate conferences, support groups for people leaving restrictive situations. I know this isn't what you signed up for, but I think you've tapped into something people need. She attached a list. 15 speaking requests. Some paid, some not. All of them wanting to hear about institutional trauma and personal autonomy from someone who'd actually lived it. Alexander read the list twice. Then he called Sarah back. You were right. I need a bigger plan. I usually am. What changed your mind? I just got 15 speaking requests. People want to hear this story. So tell it. But tell it on your terms. Not because someone's paying you, or because it'll rehabilitate your image, or because you want revenge on the palace. Tell it because it might help someone else survive what you survived. How do I do that? You start by deciding what you actually want to say, not what people want to hear, what you need them to know. Alexander thought about the young man's terrified eyes, about his father's deathbed apology, about Claire's final message, about all the ways people destroyed themselves trying to fit into shapes that weren't theirs. I want them to know that leaving is possible, that it's messy and painful, and you'll lose people you love, but that staying in a cage just because it's familiar is its own kind of death. Then say that. Say it everywhere they'll let you, and build something that helps people take that first step. Over the next 6 months, Alexander built something he never expected. Not a foundation or a formal organization, but a network. He spoke at conferences and universities and support groups. He connected people who were leaving restrictive institutions with resources, and other people who'd made similar journeys. He wrote essays about institutional trauma that got published in places he'd never imagined. And slowly, without planning to, he became known for something other than his royal scandal. He became the person who'd chosen himself and survived. The offers got bigger. Book deals, documentary proposals, invitations to speak at the United Nations about institutional reform. Alexander turned down most of them. The ones that felt like exploitation or publicity stunts or attempts to turn his pain into entertainment. But he accepted the ones that felt real. The small nonprofits helping people leave abusive religious organizations, the veterans groups dealing with institutional betrayal, the LGBTQ support networks for people rejected by their families. He spoke to them honestly, not as an expert, not as someone who'd figured it all out, but as someone still in the middle of the journey, still learning what it meant to build a life from scratch. On a cold November morning, exactly 2 years after his father's funeral, Alexander stood in a community center in Leeds talking to 20 people who'd recently left various restrictive situations: cults, controlling families, abusive partnerships, corporate cultures that demanded everything and gave nothing back. He looked at their faces and saw his own reflection. The fear, the guilt, the constant questioning of whether they'd made the right choice. Here's what I know, he said. You're going to doubt yourself every day. You're going to miss parts of what you left, even the bad parts, because at least they were familiar. You're going to see people from your old life succeeding in ways you're not, and you're going to wonder if you're the problem. Someone in the front row nodded, tears streaming down their face. But here's what else I know. Every day you spend building a life that's actually yours, you get a little bit stronger. a little bit more certain. The voice that tells you you're not good enough gets quieter. And eventually you wake up one morning and realize you've survived. Not just existed, but actually survived. After the session, a woman in her 50s approached him. She looked exhausted and determined in equal measure. I left my family's business 6 months ago. They've frozen me out completely. But listening to you, I realize I'm not alone. You're not. Not even close. She handed him a card. I run a support group for people who've left family businesses. We could use a speaker, someone who gets it. Alexander looked at the card, then at the woman, then at the 20 people packing up their things and preparing to return to lives they were still learning how to navigate. I'd be honored. That night, Alexander sat in his flat, now slightly less shabby after 2 years of actual furniture and heat that worked consistently. He made tea and opened his laptop, looking at the calendar Sarah had helped him create. Speaking engagements, support group meetings, a book proposal his agent kept pushing him to finish. His phone rang, an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Alexander? The voice was familiar but uncertain. It took him a moment to place it. Sebastian? Yeah, his brother sounded tired. I hope this isn't a bad time. It's fine. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Sebastian paused. I wanted to tell you something. Okay. I watched your Oxford talk, about 100 times actually, and I realized you were right. About everything. About Dad. About the institution. About all of it. Alexander sat down slowly. Sebastian, what are you saying? I'm saying I'm miserable. I'm 29 years old. I'm King of England, and I wake up every morning wishing I was literally anyone else. His voice cracked. And I don't know what to do about it. You can't leave. You know that. I know. But I can stop pretending it's fine. I can stop acting like this is some great honor instead of a prison sentence. I can at least be honest. Alexander felt something shift in his chest. When did you realize this? About 3 months after you left. But I was too angry to admit you were right. Too invested in hating you to see that you'd actually been braver than any of us. I wasn't brave. I was desperate. Maybe that's the same thing. Sebastian took a breath. Look, I'm not asking for absolution or reconciliation or whatever. I just wanted you to know that you weren't wrong about any of it. And I'm sorry I made it harder than it needed to be. Alexander looked out his window at Manchester's city lights, feeling the distance between himself and his former life stretching and contracting at once. Thank you. That means more than you know. Will you? Sebastian hesitated. Will you answer if I call again? Not for official stuff. Just to talk. As brothers instead of symbols. Yeah, I'll answer. After they hung up, Alexander sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about forgiveness and family and the slow process of rebuilding things he'd thought were permanently destroyed. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Big news! That book proposal you've been avoiding? Publisher just offered a real advance. Not get-rich money, but enough to quit the charity job and write full-time. Alexander stared at the message, feeling opportunity and terror in equal measure. Writing a book meant exposing everything. Meant turning his private pain into public narrative, meant spending a year reliving every mistake and humiliation. It also meant helping people who needed to hear that survival was possible. He typed back, "Tell them yes." The book took 18 months to write. Alexander rented a cottage in the Lake District and spent long days putting his story into words that didn't sanitize or dramatize. Just truth. Messy, complicated, devastating truth about what it cost to leave everything he'd known and build something new from the wreckage. He interviewed other people who'd made similar journeys, former cult members, ex-politicians, people who'd walked away from family fortunes or arranged marriages or careers that were destroying them. Their stories wove through his own, creating a tapestry of institutional trauma and personal resilience. The hardest chapter was about Clara, about falling in love with an illusion and then being betrayed by the reality. About learning that even genuine connection could be poisoned by circumstance. About forgiving her and himself for the disaster they'd created together. He sent her a draft, asked permission to include her story. She responded 3 days later, "Use it all, every ugly detail. If my mistakes can help someone else avoid the same pain, then at least they'll have meant something." The book, titled The Weight of Crowns, a memoir of leaving everything behind, published on a rainy Tuesday in October. Alexander did no publicity tour, no television appearances, no carefully managed PR campaign. The book sold itself. Within 2 weeks, it hit bestseller lists across 3 countries. Not because of scandal, but because people recognized themselves in it. The executives trapped in corporate cultures that demanded their souls. The children of controlling parents. The partners in relationships that required them to disappear. Reviews called it brutally honest and devastatingly vulnerable. Some criticized him for airing family secrets. Others praised him for finally telling a truth the monarchy had spent centuries hiding. Alexander ignored both camps. He was done caring what people thought about his choices. On a bright spring morning, 3 years after his father's funeral, Alexander stood in Windsor near the street corner where he'd first met Clara. The flower stand was gone, replaced by a coffee shop that didn't know its own history. He bought a coffee and walked to the bridge where they'd first kissed, feeling the weight of memory without the sting of regret. His phone buzzed. A message from a number saved simply as C. I finished the book. It's beautiful and terrible and true. Thank you for not making me a villain. You were never a villain, just someone trying to survive impossible circumstances. 3 dots appeared, then, we both were, I think. Yeah, we were. I'm getting married next month, to someone who knows exactly who I am and chooses me anyway. Thought you should know. Alexander smiled, surprised by how genuinely happy the news made him. That's incredible, Clara. I'm truly happy for you. Are you happy? Really? He thought about the question, about his work with people leaving restrictive institutions, about the book helping strangers find courage, about his slowly rebuilding relationship with Sebastian, about the life he'd constructed from absolute nothing. Yeah, I think I actually am. Good, you deserve it. So do you. The conversation ended there. No dramatic closure. No final reconciliation. Just 2 people acknowledging that they'd both found something resembling peace on the other side of devastation. Alexander finished his coffee and walked back through Windsor's streets, past the palace where he'd grown up, past the gates where he'd made his rainy declaration, past all the landmarks of his former life. He felt nothing, not anger, not longing, not regret, just the quiet neutrality of knowing that chapter was finished. His phone rang. Sarah, you sitting down? No, should I be? The UN called. They want you to speak at a summit on institutional reform and human rights. It's in Geneva next month. Full expenses, decent speaking fee, and a platform to talk about this stuff on a global stage. Alexander stopped walking. The UN? Yeah. Apparently your book resonated with some high-level people who've been trying to reform various institutional structures. They think your perspective could help. What do I have to do? Just tell your truth. Same thing you've been doing, but to diplomats and policymakers instead of support groups. Alexander looked up at the gray English sky, feeling the impossible distance between where he'd started and where he'd ended up. Tell them yes. The Geneva summit was unlike anything Alexander had experienced. Diplomats from 50 countries, NGO leaders, former political prisoners, people who'd spent their lives fighting institutions far more oppressive than the British monarchy. He felt like an imposter standing among them. But when he took the stage and told his story, something shifted in the room. These people who'd faced dictatorships and authoritarian regimes and systems designed to crush dissent recognized something in his experience. The institutional pressure, the erasure of self, the impossible choice between survival and duty. After his talk, a woman from Myanmar approached him. She'd spent 5 years in prison for opposing her government. She'd lost her family, her career, her health. Your suffering is different than mine, she said, but the choice was the same. Stay silent and die slowly, or speak truth and lose everything. Alexander felt humbled and connected in equal measure. How did you survive? I remembered that institutions are temporary. They feel permanent because they're old and powerful, but they're just collections of people making choices. And people can always choose differently. Even kings? Especially kings. Because when someone with power chooses integrity over institution, it gives everyone else permission to do the same. The summit lasted 3 days. Alexander met activists and reformers from around the world, heard stories that made his royal drama seem small and privileged, but also heard recognition, Heard people say that his willingness to walk away from power had inspired them to keep fighting their own battles. On the final night, Alexander stood on his hotel balcony overlooking Lake Geneva, watching lights reflect on dark water. His phone rang. Sebastian. How's Geneva? Humbling. How's London? Exactly the same as it always is. Which is the problem? Sebastian paused. I'm thinking about making some changes to how the monarchy operates. More transparency. Less formality. Actually acknowledging that we're human. That'll go over well. Probably not. But watching you build something real from nothing made me realize I'm wasting my life managing appearances. At least I can try to make the cage slightly less suffocating for whoever comes after me. Alexander felt pride for his brother, real pride, untainted by resentment or competition. That's good, Sebastian. Really good. Yeah, well, someone had to be the brave one first. You just happened to be better at it. After they hung up, Alexander stayed on the balcony for another hour, thinking about his father, about how Edward had spent his entire life serving an institution and died wishing he'd chosen differently, about how that legacy had fractured his sons in opposite directions but ultimately pushed them both toward the same truth. That power without authenticity was just performance, and performance without soul was just slow death. 6 months after Geneva, Alexander was back in Manchester. The book had funded a small foundation dedicated to helping people leave restrictive institutions. Nothing massive, just a handful of staff and a network of volunteers who provided resources, counseling, and community for people making the same impossible choice Alexander had made. He spent his days running the foundation and his evenings speaking at support groups. The work was hard and endless and never quite enough, but it was real. Every person they helped was a life changed. Every institution that reformed slightly was a small victory. On a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, Alexander was reviewing grant applications when Marcus appeared in the doorway. He'd retired from Royal Security 3 years ago and now worked part-time for the foundation, handling logistics and occasionally reminding Alexander to eat. Someone's here to see you. Who? Wouldn't say. Just asked if you had a few minutes. Alexander walked to the reception area and stopped cold. His mother stood by the window, looking older and smaller than he'd ever seen her. Catherine was wearing a simple coat and no jewelry, no security detail visible, no royal entourage, just a woman in her 60s who looked tired and uncertain. Mother. Alexander. She turned to face him fully. Can we talk? They walked to a nearby park, the kind of anonymous green space where no one recognized former royals or queen's consort. They sat on a bench overlooking a small pond while children played nearby. Catherine spoke first. I read your book. Alexander had sent her a copy, not expecting acknowledgement. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. I was angry for months after it published. Felt betrayed, like you'd exposed family secrets for profit. Is that why you're here? To tell me that? No. Catherine's voice was soft. I'm here to tell you that you were right. About your father. About me. About all of it. She looked at the pond, her eyes distant. I spent 40 years being the perfect queen consort. I sacrificed every personal desire, every authentic feeling, every part of myself that didn't fit the role. And I told myself it was noble. That duty mattered more than happiness. That I was serving something greater than myself. She turned to Alexander, tears in her eyes. But I was just scared. Scared of what I'd be without the title. Scared of admitting that I'd wasted my life on a lie. So I demanded you make the same sacrifice. And when you refused, I hated you for having the courage I never had. Mom, don't. Let me finish. Catherine wiped her eyes. Your father died wishing he'd chosen differently. I don't want to die with the same regret. So I'm here to tell you that I'm proud of you. Proud that you had the strength to leave. Proud of the work you're doing. Proud that you chose yourself instead of the institution. Alexander felt his own tears coming. Thank you. I don't deserve thanks. I deserve your anger. But I'm hoping maybe someday you can forgive me for trying to trap you in the same cage that trapped me. I already have. They sat in silence for a while, watching ducks navigate the pond. Eventually, Catherine spoke again. Can I ask you something? Anything. Do you regret it? Any of it? Alexander thought about the question he'd been asked 1,000 times. by journalists, by supporters, by critics. He'd always given diplomatic answers, nuanced responses that acknowledged complexity. But this was his mother, and she deserved the truth. I regret hurting people. I regret not being honest sooner. I regret the pain I caused Evelyn and you and Dad and everyone who got caught in the blast radius of my escape. But do I regret leaving? No, because staying would have killed me, maybe not physically, but in every way that matters. Catherine nodded slowly. I understand that now. I wish I'd understood it earlier. Me too. Before she left, Catherine hugged him. A real hug, not the formal embrace of royal obligation. Just a mother holding her son. I love you, Alexander. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it without conditions. I love you too, Mom. After she left, Alexander sat on the bench for another hour, feeling pieces of his past finally settling into place. Not resolution exactly, but something close. The quiet acknowledgement that healing was possible, even across years of damage. His phone buzzed. An email from a stranger. Mr. Beaumont, I'm writing to thank you. I've been planning to leave my family's business for 3 years, but couldn't find the courage. Reading your book gave me permission to choose myself. I gave my notice yesterday. I'm terrified and free and more alive than I've felt in a decade. Thank you for showing me it's possible. Alexander read the email twice, feeling the weight and gift of it. This was why he'd written the book. Why he spoke at support groups and conferences. Why he'd built the foundation, not to be famous or vindicated or proven right, but to give other people permission to choose themselves. He walked back to the office, where Marcus was organizing files, and Sarah was on the phone negotiating a partnership with another nonprofit. They looked up when he entered. You okay? Sarah asked. Yeah. Alexander smiled. Better than okay, actually. I think I might finally be figuring this out. Figuring what out? Who I am without the crown. And? Still not entirely sure. But I'm starting to think that's the point. That we're all just works in progress, and that's enough. Sarah grinned. Look at you, being all emotionally mature and self-aware. Don't get used to it. That evening, Alexander stood on the roof of his building watching the sun set over Manchester. The city spread out below him, full of people living their messy, complicated lives. Somewhere in that sprawl were people he'd helped. People who'd heard his story and found courage to change their own. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. From palace corridors to flower stands to Cornish cottages to foundation offices. Every step had been terrifying and necessary. His phone buzzed one last time. A message from Sebastian. Just announced some reforms. Transparency initiatives. Mental health resources for royal staff. Small stuff, but it's a start. Thought you'd want to know. Alexander typed back, I'm proud of you. 3 dots appeared. Then, learned from the best. Alexander looked out at the city, at the life he'd built from ruins and stubbornness, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the absence of pain or regret, not the erasure of mistakes, but the quiet knowledge that he'd survived, that he'd chosen himself and built something real from the wreckage, that his story might help others survive their own impossible choices. He'd left everything behind, the crown, the palace, the security of knowing exactly who he was supposed to be. And in return, he'd found something infinitely more valuable, himself, messy and complicated and still figuring it out, but finally, irrevocably, his own.